Things that got banned because one person ruined it for everyone. Last meal larceny. It's no secret that even the worst people on this earth still get the opportunity to have a nice meal before they go. The American tradition of offering a last meal to people on death row has been going on for a long time. However, did you know that in most prisons, last meals are not nearly as customizable or as extravagant as they once were? Let me explain. Now, the tradition of a death row last meal is definitely most common in the United States. However, this tradition is actually rather old, predating both the United States itself as well as the entire Christian religion. You see, for thousands of years, across almost every culture in the entire world, it was customary to give those a last meal who were set for death. The reasoning for this in ancient times was rooted in fear, specifically the fear that the spirits of the executed would come back as hungry ghosts if the deceased individual was not properly fed before their execution. That alone is kind of hilarious, considering they are more scared that they will come back to haunt them because they were well fed, rather than, literally executed. But regardless, it's made its way through history in different civilizations and empires until it got to the modern day. For example, the Greeks would give their soon-to-be executed prisoners a final meal because they believed it was necessary for the dead to cross over into the underworld. And because they didn't want these individuals to return to haunt the overworld, they would give them a proper meal. And not too differently, in ancient Rome, they would give not only their criminals, but also gladiators large meals before the days of their fights in case they happened to have an injury or death during the games, ensuring that they crossed over to the other side without fault. And already, it's kind of seeming like the ticket to heaven is, well, a good meal. Now, focusing back in on the United States, for example, the last meal tradition made its way into the American prison system in the early 1800s. However, this practice was finally formalized by several states in the early 1900s, with different states having their own rules, with Texas being a notable example, specifically because in every state the rules varied on what the meal could be. Most states that offered a custom last meal had certain rules. For example, in Florida, your meal could be whatever you wanted, as long as the ingredients were purchased locally and didn't cost more than $40. And in Oklahoma, for example, the cost limit is only $25. And in Louisiana, of all places, typically during the last meal, the prison warden will join the prisoner for this last meal, which I could only imagine is a tense dinner. But interestingly, out of all of the places that offered a last meal, Texas was notable for being one of the most generous. Prisons would typically offer large requests, not setting extremely harsh budgets on the food. This, I'm sure, was appreciated by inmates on death row. However, it didn't take long for Texas to go from being a generous state to being a state that didn't offer custom last meals at all. And the reason why the state of Texas changed this rule is because of one individual. Lawrence Brewer, like basically everybody on death row, was not a good person. But Lawrence Brewer specifically was notably bad. Without getting too much into graphic detail, the reason why Lawrence Brewer was on death row was because him and two other individuals pulled a man named James Byrd Jr. from the back of their truck after brutally assaulting him, dragging him to his death simply because of his skin color. This hate crime and murder, fortunately, was punished to the fullest degree, although it's extremely disgusting that it even happened in the first place. With that being said, even though Lawrence was on death row, he was still honored a last meal. And for this meal, he requested something extravagant. And the order goes as follows: 2 fried chicken steaks, a triple patty bacon cheeseburger, a cheese omelet, a bowl of fried okra, a pound of barbecued meat, 3 fajitas, a meat lover's pizza, a pint of ice cream, a slab of peanut butter fudge, and 3 root beers. Surprisingly, the Texas prison system generously honored this rather extravagant request. However, in retaliation, once Lawrence was presented with this food, he didn't take a single bite. He pushed the plates away and simply said, "I'm not hungry." After it became obvious to the prison guards that he was not going to eat, he was taken back to his cell, and the food was, I'm assuming, thrown away or potentially eaten by some very hungry prison guards. And if that was the case, honestly, I'm just glad it didn't go to waste. Unsurprisingly, once the news broke that not only was this disgusting inmate offered such a generous meal, but he didn't even touch a single bite of it, it didn't only make headlines, but it boiled the blood of prison officials in Texas. And it was because of this stunt by Lawrence Brewer that the Texas prison system instantly changed the rules, no longer offering any custom meals to anybody on death row. From when this happened in 2013 until the present day, if you are set for execution in Texas, your final meal is no longer whatever you want. It's whatever the cafeteria has that day. And while this isn't really the most upsetting story considering who this affects, people literally being killed by the government because what they did was so horrible, but it is still a pretty interesting example of one person ruining the last piece of fun people on death row could have. This may seem like a tame start because it literally only affects inmates on death row. And you're right, and that's because this video is only going to get more and more crazy as it goes on. And by crazy, I mean affects more and more people. So let's move on. the touchdown shutdown. I love sports. They're fun to play, they're fun to watch, they're fun to learn about. All around, sports are just a great thing that bring people together. But admittedly, I'm not the biggest fan of professional sports. I just don't watch it a lot. But when I do watch professional sports, one of my favorite parts of it are the extracurriculars. You know, fights in hockey, trash talk in the NBA, the hilarious flops in soccer, halftime shows, and of course, touchdown celebrations. But did you know that in American football specifically, there was a touchdown celebration that was so prolific that it actually got banned from the entire NFL? Well, if you do, you're gonna hear about it again. But if you didn't, let me tell you a crazy story. If you're a fan of American football, then the name Jimmy Graham is probably not unknown to you. Jimmy was born in 1986 in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and was drafted into the NFL in 2010 by the New Orleans Saints. Throughout his career, Jimmy played for the New Orleans Saints, the Seattle Seahawks, the Green Bay Packers, and even the Chicago Bears. And during his football career, he was not only known for his athletic ability, but also his unique touchdown celebration, with the most iconic being his football dunk on the goalpost. In case you're unfamiliar, almost every time Jimmy would get a touchdown, he would literally take the ball, run it to the goalpost, and dunk it over the post, essentially like he was dunking a basketball. This, admittedly, was pretty badass looking, although it came with consequences because he was doing it so much, and it looked so cool that the NFL decided that no one man could have all that aura. I'm totally lying. If you look at this clip right here, you can see that after he dunks the ball, he literally bent the goalpost. And this wasn't an uncommon occurrence. Obviously, when one of the most foundational components of a sports field is, well, broken or at least misaligned, it has to be fixed instantly for the games to continue. And in the case of the goalpost being fixed after a dunk, these fixes were known to pause the game for anywhere from 2 to 20 minutes. And while these delays may seem minor, when you're talking about professional, live, televised sports, anything that throws off the schedule to that degree that isn't planned for is a major headache for networks, advertisers, and the league in general. It was for this destructive reason that the NFL ended up banning the dunk on the field goal, which in my opinion kind of solidified this move as one of the coolest touchdown celebrations ever, even though it was pretty disruptive and I'm sure really annoying for people actually working the game, and probably even watching too. And while this is once again more of a niche rule that doesn't affect too many people, I would definitely argue it at least affects more people and likely also had a trickle-down effect. Because imagine if you were growing up watching Jimmy Graham play football and your goal was to grow up playing the NFL and dunk yourself. If that was your goal in life and then you heard that dunking was banned, you probably just had one of your biggest dreams crushed. And while sure, you could probably dunk in amateur leagues, if the goalpost is being bent in the NFL, I can only imagine what would happen if you're dunking on amateur league nets. And I wouldn't be surprised if people dunking at home injured themselves or broke goalposts altogether. But yeah, Jimmy Graham not only made his own touchdown celebration, but used it so much he got it banned. And well, the rest is history. The sushi situation. I've never been to Japan, but it's definitely extremely high on my bucket list of places I want to go. The culture is so cool, the landscapes are beautiful, and the technology is just interesting. Obviously, here in the Western world, we enjoy a lot of Japanese technology, but over in Japan, they're still gatekeeping some of their coolest stuff for themselves. Most notably, in my opinion, the food conveyor belt. Honestly, I couldn't even tell you where I first saw or heard of this, but I just remember seeing people sitting at a restaurant and food coming to them on a conveyor belt and just being so enamored by it. Initially, I questioned why Golden Corral didn't get this instantly, but then I thought to myself, well, if Golden Corral had this, they would probably have to install wider doors so people could leave. But focusing back on the point, these food conveyor belts are relatively popular across Japan. However, in one popular sushi chain in the Gifu Prefecture in Japan, the conveyor belt was not only canceled, but replaced with a cartoon version, all because of the acts of one individual. It was a regular day near the beginning of 2023. People were enjoying their food at the Shoshiro restaurant in Japan. This restaurant obviously was known for its conveyor belt system. However, on this now infamous day, a 17-year-old boy walked into the Sushiro restaurant and sat at a table. During his stay, he had the very dull idea to film himself licking soy sauce bottles and teacups and even sushi and putting them back on plates, sending them down the conveyor belt for other people to have. Now, this disgusting video went viral, and seemingly overnight, this video had over 40 million views and was being posted on news outlets everywhere, seemingly exposing the vulnerability of this honor-based system. You know, having the honor to not mess with other people's food. To some, this instance may be considered a prank. However, the Japanese government and the restaurant chain did not see it that way at all. And this incident was actually dubbed sushi terrorism because of how seriously it was taken by Japanese officials. Because of the widespread outrage that was caused by this viral video, action was taken by both the police and the company that owns Shishiro. The boy that did this food licking was arrested, but on top of being arrested by the police, he was also sued by Shishiro for over $480,000 US in damages. And while being sued for nearly $500,000 may seem steep for licking some food, you have to understand that A, that's unacceptable and just disgusting and could be a health hazard if this individual, had diseases. But even still, this video going viral was detrimental for the restaurant itself and ended up causing the Shishiro restaurant chain nearly 16 billion yen in market value, simply because people saw this video, got grossed out, and decided they wouldn't be returning anytime soon. But not only did the company lose money because people were simply not going, the stock value of this company also dropped massively because investors were speculative about how the company can recover from such a PR disaster. And because the stock for the parent company that owned Shishiro tanked, Shishiro acted quickly and seemingly overnight replaced all of their real conveyor belts with real food with digital conveyor belts that had digital food that you can click on to order foods, but gone were the days where real food would just pass you by. And honestly, it's unfortunate that, well, one person ruined it for everybody. Although there is an argument to be made that while this dumb prank was disgusting, it also did expose a vulnerability that could have had worse consequences if somebody more devious wanted to expose it. But what do you guys think? Feel free to pause quickly and comment, but I'm gonna move on. The Tylenol tragedy. If you're somebody with an active Netflix subscription and a fan of true crime, then you very likely saw the documentary recently released about the Tylenol murders. This documentary was both interesting and also shocking, because as somebody who was born nearly 20 years after the Tylenol murder event took place, it's really quite crazy to try to imagine what a medicine bottle would look like without tamper-proof protection. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what the Tylenol murders are, they're actually rather mysterious. And to sum it up rather briefly, from September to October in 1982, there was a string of at least 7 deaths that were attributed to a mass poisoning of Tylenol extra-strength pills. This event was extremely unfortunate and killed both men, women, and children. And one of the saddest parts about this entire situation is that not only was nobody ever caught and convicted for this mass poisoning due to the fact that it made major headlines, also inspired other lunatics to poison other medicine bottles across the country. That's about all the detail I'm going to go into in regards to the murder specifically, primarily because next week I'm posting my part 2 to my Killers on the Loose video. And all I'm going to say is the Tylenol murders may make an appearance on that list. So if you're waiting for part 2 to my now fastest growing video, well, tune in next week. But focusing back in on the aftermath of this extremely upsetting situation. What happened and what did somebody ruin for everybody? Well, as I mentioned earlier, when these murders took place in 1982, medicine bottles had nowhere near the precautions they have today, largely because of this event. But the aftermath of these murders wasn't just 7 innocent people dead and Tylenol now having to put a few extra steps in the process of opening a bottle. As I already stated, when this story hit the mainstream, it not only inspired copycats, but terrorized the entire nation, as now anything seemed like it could have been potentially contaminated. And if you're somebody who experiences contamination OCD, I can only imagine that this would be a living nightmare. During the time that these murders took place, Tylenol had a 35% market share when it comes to over-the-counter pain medication. But after the murders took place, that market share dropped from 35% to 8%. And it took a lot of action from Tylenol to rebuild that trust among the community. And while these murders were undoubtedly tragic, there was at least a positive outcome out of these nearly unthinkable actions. That positive outcome, of course, being A, accountability from pharmaceutical companies and also widespread reform. For example, as soon as this crisis took place, Johnson & Johnson, the company that owns Tylenol, issued a massive recall, essentially taking over $100 million worth of product off shelves across the nation. On top of this, Johnson & Johnson established a strong relationship with the Chicago Police Department, where the murders took place, to further be involved in the investigation. And on top of this, they also formed stronger bonds with the FBI and the FDA. All of these relationships were formed with the hope of finding the person who laced the Tylenol tablets that ended up killing innocent people. But of course, the most notable outcome that came out of this entire tragedy was the development and implementation of tamper-resistant packaging, most notably being induction seals. You know, the things that are really annoying to peel off every time you open basically anything nowadays. This tamper-resistant packaging became more or less of an industry standard, and that is a genuinely positive outcome, although it's upsetting that it took such tragedy for this seemingly simple implementation to be, well, implemented. But that's just on the Johnson & Johnson side. On the governmental side, product tampering was made an official crime to further prevent any actions even remotely similar to the Tylenol murders. And on top of both of these beneficial changes, the FDA also introduced more stringent regulations regulations when it comes to filled capsules instead of powder pressed tablets to help further prevent product tampering. And it was with all of these positive changes, and I'm sure millions, if not billions spent in PR, Tylenol's market share was able to return in only a year's time, which is rather impressive. But to circle this back to the entire point of this video, things that got banned because one person ruined it, let's dissect this a bit. What was technically banned in this situation? Well, I guess product tampering and, well, unsealed pill bottles. And while those are things that are definitely not beneficial, the reason why I wanted to talk about this specifically was because, well, nothing was really banned per se besides things that already should have been banned, but I wanted to talk about it because one person definitely ruined something for everybody. That being basically the trust of people to not mess with products on shelves, causing almost everything nowadays to be sealed for your safety. Or at least that's what they say. And ultimately, I do think this was a beneficial change, although it is kind of upsetting why it is required. But just so this video technically fits the theme, the thing that was banned was, yeah, you can't sell pharmaceuticals without having a tamper-proof seal. But in case you want more of an example of ruining for everybody, although it wasn't banned, in that Halloween that followed the Tylenol murders in October of 1982, because people were so paranoid about the recently poisoned Tylenol, people were extremely suspicious of poisoned candy, which is why in Halloween of 1982, it was reported that Halloween attendance across the country was at an all-time low. And grocery stores even reported that candy sales were down over 20% compared to previous years, which honestly, I believe is a valid fear. And is just another upsetting example of how one person's actions can affect, well, an entire nation. The mustache must go. I wish I had a better transition, but you know how I just talked about one person's actions affecting an entire country? Well, now we're going to discuss how one person's actions affected, well, the entire world. Look at this image right here. What is the first thing when you think of when you see this piece of facial hair? Did you say famous, beloved comedian Charlie Chaplin? Well, I'm sure a few of you little hipsters did, but I would say the overwhelming majority of you instantly thought of Adolf Hitler when you saw this mustache. And I would bet money that you don't even know the name of this mustache. If you ever had to refer to this mustache, you would call it a Hitler mustache, which just goes to prove how synonymous this mustache is with the evil dictator from Nazi Germany. The traditional name of this mustache is known as a toothbrush mustache, and it's a small, narrow style of mustache that just sits on the center of your upper lip. And as I mentioned, before it gained popularity in, well, politics, it was popular among normal people as well as comedy legends such as Charlie Chaplin and Oliver Hardy. But if you try to sport this mustache yourself, well, nobody's gonna say, hey, nice Charlie Chaplin mustache. And it was for this reason that this facial hair was more or less retired. Admittedly, the toothbrush mustache, at least to my knowledge, was never formally outright banned, at least legally. But I would definitely say socially, this mustache was definitely banned, although that doesn't mean that there was attempts to bring it back. Probably the most infamous example of somebody sporting a toothbrush mustache in the more modern era is Michael Jordan of all people. And you've just got to ask yourself, if anybody can bring back a piece of culturally banned facial hair, it has to be basketball legend Michael Jordan, right? But unfortunately, even he was not powerful enough to overcome the stigma of the mustache. And it was for this reason that even he himself faced controversy for sporting this mustache that, in my opinion, didn't really resemble a Hitler mustache too much because he also had a little bit of a goatee thing going on. And also there's some other glaring differences between him and Hitler. Mainly the haircut. I think it's just the haircut. But regardless, not only did he decide to have this mustache, but he also rocked it in a legit commercial. And I guess nobody on set just told him to not do that. But, you know, it's Michael Jordan in his prime. I wouldn't either. But yeah, even Michael Jordan couldn't have a mustache that even loosely resembled the toothbrush mustache simply because the stigma is just so bad. And I guess rightfully so. Although it is a bit unfortunate because the mustache didn't do anything. It was the man wearing the mustache. But in case something being socially banned isn't enough for you, well, there's also a plethora of things that are actually banned due to the actions of Adolf Hitler. One of the more interesting bans is the fact that several countries have actually outright banned naming yourself or your child Adolf Hitler. For example, in Germany, Malaysia, Mexico, and New Zealand, it is all illegal to be named Adolf Hitler, which I think is understandable. But I think potentially more interesting is that in some US states, it is also prohibited to be named Adolf, although this isn't federally enforced and it's on a state-by-state basis. And another rather unfortunate byproduct of the entire, well, Nazi thing, besides all of the obvious war crimes and acts against humanity, is the fact that Hitler not only stole the swastika from Hinduism, but essentially tarnished the symbol forever. You see, I think it's relatively common knowledge now that the swastika doesn't originate with the Nazi Party. It actually originates in Hindu culture. In some Hindu cultures, the swastika can either mean prosperity and good luck, or being conducive to well-being, and it's a generally positive symbol. However, when the Nazis appropriated the symbol and used it to, well, represent one of the worst regimes to ever exist in modern, if not all of history, the symbol that they appropriated was essentially tarnished forever. which is unfortunate because there has been some viral videos online of some uneducated person with a camera berating an Indian person for being a Nazi, when in reality, that's not the case at all. Beyond these few more lighter-hearted examples, there's a lot of other things that were outright banned due to the actions of Adolf Hitler. Although, for the sake of this video being a little bit more lighthearted, I want to discuss some that were not as, well, straight up depressing. And just to quickly save this video from getting too dark, I just wanted to say, by the time you're watching this video, we probably hit 1 million subscribers. And I just want to say thank you guys so much for all the love and support on the entire channel. If you like my content and like what I do on this channel, please consider subscribing. We are no longer on the road to 1 million, we are on the road to 2 million. And if we're being honest, 10 million. At least that's the goal for now. YouTube does tell me that nearly 75% of you are not subscribed. So if you're watching this video and want to see videos from me every single Friday, subscribe and maybe even turn on the bell icon so you actually get notified when my videos go live. Oh, and by the way, if you really like this video, leave a like or comment part 2, and I'll definitely make a part 2 because I love making videos that my viewers actually want to see. But enough shilling. Thank you guys so much for the support. Let's get to our final section. Satisfaction not guaranteed. In the year 2025 and soon to be 2026, consumers are more privy than ever. And that's because businesses and individuals have been scamming people since the beginning of time. If you don't believe me, watch my video about scams in every time period. But with that being said, with people being more and more skeptical, businesses have had to come up with ways to convince customers that not only are they not being scammed, but if they are unhappy with their purchase, the business will take care of them. And it was for this reason that the satisfaction guarantee was established. The satisfaction guarantee is not necessarily a formal or governmental rule, it's essentially just a marketing trend and a company policy that kind of took off across corporate America. And honestly, it's a positive one that's in the consumer's favor. Now, I don't know about you, but every time I hear satisfaction guaranteed or refunds with no questions asked, I always am a bit skeptical. Although I've never really taken up any brands on this besides, well, you know, the basic refund. But I may be more of a rare breed here because I think some people get their fair use out of satisfaction guaranteed, and in the case I'm about to discuss, some people, unfortunately, well, abuse this system and ruin it for everyone. Unfortunately, there is no shortage of people abusing systems that are meant to help people and just offer fairness to all. And those people, I can confidently say, suck. And while to this day, satisfaction guarantees are still offered widely, I do want to discuss one example where somebody's selfish behavior revoked the consumer rights of a lot of customers from a specific brand. The brand in question is LL Bean. LL Bean is a famous clothing company that has had an almost legendary lifetime guarantee that it's offered for a long time on most of its clothes. The company took pride in this guarantee and used it as a symbol of the company's commitment to their product quality and overall customer satisfaction. And that, in my opinion, is noble. But as we learned in the first section of this video, no good deed goes unpunished. And just like somebody on death row exploiting a generous Texas prison, somebody buying jeans is going to exploit a customer satisfaction policy. So here's the deal. For the longest time, LL Bean had one of the best lifetime guarantees possible. And it actually went on for decades. How it worked is customers could return any LL Bean product at any time to any location for a full refund. It didn't matter how old or how worn the garment was. If you had an LL Bean garment and you were no longer satisfied with it, you could take it to any LL Bean store to have it replaced. And in my opinion, that system is so cool. But of course, people had to ruin it. And in the case of LL Bean, they in 2018 made a statement and officially changed their policy. They essentially ended and revoked the lifetime guarantee on most of their products, limiting it to the standard return within a year if you have a proof of purchase. The 1-year return compared to the 30-day return is still generous, but it's a massive shift from what they originally had. And LL Bean even said themselves that the reason that they ended this program was due to a pattern of abuse of a small group of people, and they could no longer enable this behavior. Now, with that being said, LL Bean never pursued any legal actions or dropped any specific customer names, although they did make it known that people were abusing their generosity, and for that reason, they had to make some changes. This is definitely one of the more lighter examples we've discussed in this video, but it's definitely something that affects probably the most of us. And to me, it's truly just upsetting how one person or a small group of people can truly ruin a good thing for everybody. And I know it's easy at this point to get nihilistic and pessimistic and lose faith in humanity, but understand that it only is a small group of people doing it. And while it sucks that good things are being ruined, most people aren't doing these awful things. But I guess if we've learned anything from this video, all it takes is one. Okay, this is off topic, but do you smell that? It smells like you didn't shower. And if that's the case, I feel bad for your anime body pillow. But in case you did, you're obviously not using the right stuff, which is why this video is sponsored by Cheeky Soap. Cheeky Soap is my favorite soap company by far, and it was actually founded by this guy.
Hey, Brody.
Over the last year, I got absolutely obsessed with bar soap, but I quickly ran into one major problem. Almost every bar soap that I tried left my sensitive skin feeling dry. It was for this reason that when I first tried Cheeky, I was so impressed that it didn't only smell good, but it literally left my skin feeling moisturized after just one shower, which is why I was so eager to partner with them when they asked me. Not only do they have an amazing handful of core scents in their collection, but on top of that, Cheeky even told me that if we're able to get enough support, they are willing to make a custom Trust Me Bro soap bar. So, if you've never tried bar soap before, or you use bar soap and are looking for something new, I would definitely recommend giving Cheeky a try using my link in the description to not only get a discount, but to help support the channel. Click the link in the description, use my code, and get the starter bundle today to upgrade your showers. I guarantee you will not be looking back. Now, let's get back to the video. How to escape North Korea. North Korea is an elusive country, unlike any other. And while a lot of what happens in North Korea is a secret, the cruelty, poverty, and human rights violations are definitely not hidden. North Korea is globally known for its poor treatment of its people and tyrannical dictator. However, the world seemingly just allows it. And that is a topic for a different discussion. But I mention this all to say that North Korea is not a good place. And for that reason, it's unsurprising that every single day people try to escape this country. Those people are known as defectors. The record of North Korean defectors goes all the way back to 1998, with a recorded count of 947 people escaping the country. From 1998 all the way up until 2011, we saw a rise in the amount of people that were able to escape, with a peak number of defectors of 2,914 in 2009. But after 2011, the number started to float around 1,500 and shrank all the way down to around 1,000 defectors in 2019. However, after 2019, the amount of people that were able to successfully escape plummeted. The reason for such a dramatic drop in escapees is North Korea enacted a shoot-on-sight order that essentially gave all Border Patrol the authority to shoot any person in the buffer zone surrounding North Korea who was there without permission. Escaping North Korea is scary and truly deadly, especially now more than ever. But for some living in North Korea, that risk is worth taking, and they'd rather die on the pursuit of freedom than living under the control of a dictator. Since 1998, there have been over 34,000 people in total who have been able to escape North Korea successfully. And today, I'm going to discuss some of the craziest ways that these people accomplished such a feat, starting tame and getting crazier as the list goes on. Leveraging wealth and social class. You are a high-ranking government official, specifically working with state-run businesses. You are one of the extremely rare, wealthy North Koreans, at least relatively, and you experience privileges many North Koreans could never dream of. Not only do you have a comfortable dwelling and consistent access to quality food and clean water, but you also have access to something that almost resembles freedom. You work tireless days, and sometimes even nights, and you are quite literally being worked to the bone. However, every day on your commute, you realize how grateful you are to be in the position you're in. And while you are grateful for your position, you understand that even the best position in North Korea still isn't all that great. And for some time, while on business, specifically in mainland China, you've seen the difference in quality of life, and you've been slowly taking notes on how you could potentially leave your job. Your job grants you a lot of authority, and you are well connected not only with the North Korean government, but with government officials and high-ranking businessmen in China. One night, while drinking at a bar in mainland China, half asleep, a man sits beside you. He doesn't say anything, but he hands you his card. You tell this man that you're not on business hours, and you appreciate it, but you're just looking to relax. And the man sternly looks you in the eyes and says, "I know you're North Korean, and if you ever want to start a new life, you call this number." This moment was sobering, as this man wasn't speaking to you in Mandarin. He was speaking fluent Korean. And before you could even ask another question, he got up and left. You wake up the following morning, early, hungover in this Chinese hotel. You briefly remember that crazy dream you had last night until you reach into your pocket and feel that you actually got that card and that wasn't a dream. You get in the taxi and make your way back to the airport. And on your way back to North Korea, the only thing you could think of is the offer this man gave you. You assume he had to be a defector, as no mainland Chinese person would speak such perfect Korean, specifically with a North Korean accent. And nobody would recognize the fact that you were North Korean or make you such a preposterous offer unless they were sure, likely because they were in a similar situation. You get home and you're happy to see your family. And after putting your children to bed and once again going to bed late, you sit beside your wife in bed and tell her a secret. You tell her that you met somebody in China and this person could change their lives. You explain to your wife who you met and what they offered, and you notice that your wife doesn't look enthusiastic. She looks shocked. And before you could ask your wife what she thought about the possibility of potentially starting a new life and leaving North Korea, she jumps out of bed and begins screaming. She is completely repulsed by the idea that you could potentially ever want to leave the greatest nation. And she's convinced that you must be brainwashed and that you must be reported to the government immediately. Your wife is either brainwashed or simply terrified of what could happen to her if her husband was testing her loyalty to North Korea, or if anybody happened to be listening. Regardless, your wife grabs the phone and immediately starts dialing. You grab the phone and tell her that you were kidding. You were only simply testing her because nobody loved North Korea more than you, and you wanted to test your wife's loyalty to North Korea to make sure your marriage was strong. This seems to calm your wife and you both go to bed. And it's at that moment when you realize that if you were to leave North Korea, you're doing it alone. Your next trip to mainland China isn't for another 6 months, but the following day at work, you convince your boss that you have unfinished business in China, and it's best for the company if you return as soon as possible. The following week, the opportunity arises, and you're back in China. You take out the card and you give it a call. You meet the man at the same bar that you're at. After your first night in China, you call the number on the card that you were given, and you're met with an automated voice message saying coordinates and a cash value. You assume that the coordinates are where you're supposed to meet someone, and you assume that cash value is the fee required for your freedom. You meet up with this man once again, and over the course of the week you're supposed to be doing business, you get a fake Korean passport, and you are given a dedicated travel guide, aka your new wife, whose sole job is to get you to the airport safely and make sure that you are able to catch a flight from mainland China to South Korea. This isn't the woman's first rodeo, and she's able to get you through security checkpoints and past suspicious Chinese government officials, as her Chinese is perfect and her story for why she is hanging out with a South Korean man checks out. You get dropped off at the airport by this mysterious woman, and when she drops you off at the airport, she says, "Never come back." You board your flight to South Korea and your new life has begun. So yeah, this is obviously a hypothetical story, but it's an example of exactly how someone could use their wealth, connections, and status to escape North Korea. This method of escape is the most effective, the safest, and also the least common, because privileged individuals in North Korea simply are hard to come by. And the percentage of those that would even consider leaving or betraying North Korea is even smaller. However, it has been done and it needed to be mentioned. In this story I just told, I outlined a mysterious man, and this man represents a very real person and industry that exists, known as escape brokers. And their entire business model is essentially smuggling people out of North Korea, obviously for a hefty fine. However, if you're a wealthy individual, then that is a small price to pay for your freedom and for your safety, because the other methods of escape we're going to be discussing are not nearly as plush as this. The reason why this mysterious woman, who was an employee of this smuggling company, gave you a South Korean passport was, one, because it was a perfect excuse of why somebody in China would be speaking Korean, and secondly, because it raised no red flags of why a South Korean would be going to South Korea from China. If this man decided to fly from mainland China to South Korea with a North Korean passport, it is highly likely that the Chinese government would be extremely suspect of this and you would be questioned. Specifically because China has very close relations with North Korea, and also has a treaty in place where any escapees from North Korea that make it to China will be returned to North Korea by the Chinese government. So yeah, even if you are able to simply escape to China from North Korea by any means, you're definitely not free, but that's something we'll discuss later. The example I gave in the beginning focuses on businessmen or government officials who are able to essentially network with influential and powerful people and also have access to money. But there are other ways you can leverage class and status to escape, notably being high-level athletes or privileged students from these rich families who are able to both work and study abroad. In these cases, when you are out of North Korea, you can simply just not go home. And depending on where you are abroad, you can be protected, and in some cases even given citizenship as a refugee, allowing you to start a brand new life. One more thing I want to mention is the fact that in the story I gave, this character had kids. And if you're familiar with North Korean law, then you know that the North Korean government likes to punish not only you, but also your family for your crimes. And in the instance of the story I gave initially, the reason why the man was so able to confidently leave North Korea is because he used a high-level escapee broker. And one of his services that they include in their price is faking your death. So instead of being seen as an escapee by the North Korean government, this mysterious man was able to make it look like you died doing business abroad. And for that reason, your family is spared. And while this entire situation is hypothetical, the core of these conditions is based in reality. And while this man's family was spared in this instance, that is not always the case. One of the reasons this man was even allowed to travel internationally for business is because he had a family. And to the North Korean government, that is something that they see as collateral. Because if this man has a wife and kids, he is much less likely to just defect. Because the man knows that if he defects, his family will be tortured and killed on his behalf. And for most, that is reason enough to stay. Regardless, let's move on. International labor camps. You're a skinny, single, young man living in the northern part of North Korea. You're an orphan and you work on a farm. You've been working at this farm for as long as you can remember, and the people that live at this farm are the closest thing you have to family. But as you get older, it seems the worse the treatment gets, and it seems that the more work you put in, the less that you get paid. You're a full-grown man now, but the meals you get served are still the portion size you got when you were a child. And at this point, you're almost skin and bones. You've tried begging and pleading with the owners of this farm for more food, as they are the only ones providing your meals. However, they're not budging. They tell you should be grateful for what you get. And while they're not in any better of a situation, you realize that if you stay here, you're going to die. So one night, you plan your escape. Not from North Korea, but just from this farm. Under the veil of night, you escape on a dirt road with a burlap sack on your back and the rags that you've had for your entire life. You find yourself in a small village and soon realize that your money did not go nearly as far as you thought it would. So to conserve money, you decide to steal. And while it isn't like you at all, it's life or death, and you're able to justify it. And you fill your bag with food from a stand in the city square, from the village farmer's market. Before you could even close your bag, you feel two hands on your shoulder and turn around. It's a police officer, and good news, you'll have a place to sleep tonight. Bad news, you're going to jail. You're brought into jail, booked, and because of your retaliation, the punishment that you're given is 2 years in a labor camp in Russia. After 2 cruel weeks in a holding cell, you're put on a train and sent to northern Russia, where you're going to be spending the next 2 years on a lumber mill. You arrive at this mill and realize that this camp is almost fully employed by North Korean criminals, which gives you some relief as you at least have somebody to talk to, because you were expecting Russians. And while all of the guards are heavily armed Russians, those are really the only Russians around you, as this labor camp is in an extremely remote area. On your first night in the camp, you speak to one of the other North Koreans, and he tells you that you came at the perfect time, and that him and the other men at this labor camp have been planning an escape for years. And tomorrow night was the night that they leave, and that if you are brave enough, you could come with. You had no intentions of leaving North Korea and ended up in Russia by accident, but at this point, you had nothing to lose. The cold weather was unbearable, you can't stand farm work anymore, and even dying at this point sounds better than working in a Russian labor camp. You tell the man you're in, and he says, "We'll wake you up tomorrow night." You work the next day and go to bed the next night, and like he said, in the middle of the night, this man wakes you up quietly. Similar to something you did yourself not long ago, under the veil of night, you and a small group of these North Korean prisoners set off in the middle of the night. Leaving the labor camp wasn't the hard part, as security was relatively low due to the location of this labor camp and the assumption that if anybody were to leave, they would be dead within days, as the closest civilization was multiple days away on foot. And all of these cities had police that specifically do checks for North Koreans. Walking through this frozen, barren wasteland, you ask this man, "What is the plan? Where are we going? If Russian police find us, we will be sent back to North Korea. They are allies." And that's when this man reveals his master plan. Some of the criminals you are with have been in this prison for so long that they speak fluent Russian. And because of the Russian that this prisoner picked up, in the months of listening to guards, they were essentially able to map out not only where the train tracks are, but the train schedule as well. After hours of walking in the darkness, day begins to break, and you notice that your group is already smaller. 2 of the men that were in your group initially were no longer, and it's mutually assumed that they fell behind and froze to death. You and your remaining men find the train tracks, wait for the next train taking wood out of the labor camp, hop on one of the very last carts, and you are now, once again, on your way to freedom. Wow. In this hypothetical, you're in a similar situation as the first person, but obviously on a much different scale. Because you didn't even intentionally go abroad, you were just sent abroad by the government, and you had no expectations of fleeing at all. You simply accepted your fate, but you were at the right place at the right time. And fortunately, the people that you trusted had the perfect plan. Did the person in this hypothetical have ridiculous plot armor? Of course. But I figured in these fictional scenarios, obviously based on reality, it would make sense to have them at least escape at the end of the story. Because if all the stories ended with, and they were caught and killed, well, it's not really a good example of how to escape. It's how you could try to escape and then die, which is the unfortunate reality for most. But yeah, labor camps exist, and obviously they exist all over North Korea, but some of them are abroad, and they are primarily in Russia. And while nobody wants to be at a Russian labor camp, there are North Koreans who see going to a Russian labor camp as a golden opportunity to escape their country. And it's for that reason that the North Korean government is very stingy on who they send abroad. And in most cases, you're not going to be sent to an abroad labor camp. And the only reason why you in this story were even sent abroad is because you have farm experience, you've worked in cold conditions before because you lived in a northern part of North Korea, and according to your documents, you still had a living family, which is a requirement to be sent abroad. And obviously you were an orphan since birth and don't know any of your family. Legally speaking, you still had a living family, so the government assumed you had loyalty to them, which made you a much lower escapee risk. Of course, getting to Russia is similar to getting to China. You are not necessarily fully free in these countries. You're more free, but these are still countries that have close ties to North Korea. And you are at risk for being caught and being deported back to North Korea, where you'll be punished severely. And in this instance, you and the other criminals who made it to this train were taking a train that took you out of Russia and into Europe, as Europe has no allegiance to North Korea, much like the rest of the Western world. And if you're able to make it through Russia into a European country, and from there find a South Korean embassy, at that point, it's safe to say you're safe and are going to win yourself a one-way ticket to South Korea. The reason why South Korea is so desirable for North Koreans is because South Korea gives automatic citizenships to North Korean escapees, and at least the government accepts these people with open arms. Socially, there is definitely polarity on how people treat defectors, but a bit of scrutiny for being North Korean is definitely better than living in North Korea. So at this point, let's reconsider. Obviously, going north isn't ideal, because if you use the small border that borders North Korea and Russia, not only is it extremely well guarded, cold, and far from any sort of safe haven, it's only really a good option for those looking to get into a labor camp, as being sent to a labor camp allows you to cross the border safely. And now we also understand that going through China, another country that borders North Korea, is also not ideal because that border, once again, is highly guarded. And because of the connection that China has with North Korea, you're essentially still in North Korea until you're out of China, which means that you have a long ways to travel before you can really take a breath and relax. But that leaves the natural question. What about the last country that borders North Korea? Why not escape to the country that everybody wants to go, that gives you immediate asylum and citizenship? South Korea is literally connected to North Korea. It's not freezing cold. It's a country that will accept you. And this country also has people that speak the same language as you. It seems like the perfect way to escape. And while on paper, you're definitely right, there's one major issue. You're not the only person that understands this. The North Korean government understands this quite dearly. And that's why there's a demilitarized zone that stretches the entire land border of North Korea and South Korea. And while that name seems semi-safe, it's extremely deceptive, as this border is not demilitarized at all. It is very militarized. There is so much military from both North and South Korea. There is literally hundreds of thousands of soldiers on either side of this border. And in the area in between these two countries, there is active landmines, electric fences, and watchtowers with the executive order to shoot on sight. So let's get into our third and final story to outline likely the craziest and deadliest way you could escape North Korea. Escaping by land as a regular North Korean citizen. You, like many other North Koreans, are simply sick and tired of being sick and tired, and you decide you're gonna make a run for it. You live near a remote part of the border, where there are active personnel, but it's not as heavily monitored as other places. You pack a bag and set out on foot, feeling confident that you can make this land crossing. You don't see anybody, and you figure this is gonna be a walk in the park, and after hours of walking, you realize that you don't even exactly know where the border is, and for all you know, you might already be in South Korea. You walk further and further, and finally begin to feel free. You must have at this point passed the border, until you see something in the distance. You walk closer to it and you realize that it's a sign that says active minefield. And it's at this point that you realize that you are much further from the border than you thought, and you have a long ways to go. You call the sign's bluff and continue walking. And after taking a few steps and walking for 5, 10, 15, 30 minutes, you knew there was no mines and continue walking. And you're right, there was no mines, but there was snipers. Snipers that you didn't see, but they saw you. And before you can even blink, you hear a gunshot and everything goes black. Unfortunately, that is a reality for people trying to cross the land border between North and South Korea. Crossing over the water as a regular North Korean citizen. You're a young woman fed up with living in North Korea. You've been abused your whole life, and at this point, you feel that anything is better than your current existence. You studied geography in school and understand that the waters on the west coast of North Korea where you live are much more favorable than the east coast for fishermen. But if fishermen favor it, must be a reason, and the waters must be calmer, which must mean it's easier to escape. One night you head down to a local dock and brazenly steal a boat. You simply head south and plan on running into the South Korean Coast Guard. Although hours into your trip on this boat, you get caught up in a storm and you lose your motor. At this point, you're stranded at sea at the mercy of the ocean. There's essentially 3 outcomes that are possible, and I'll just go through them quickly. Option 1, you wash up on shore. You think you're in South Korea, but you're actually still in North Korea, and you're killed. The tide takes you north, and you wash up on shore in China, where you are found by police, deported to North Korea, and killed. Or, if you are extremely fortunate, you do wash up on shore in South Korea and begin a new life. Or, option 4, you lose your life at sea, either due to harsh conditions or by being caught by the North Korean Navy, which heavily patrol these waters because of people like yourself. Escaping via the land border as military personnel. The story I'm about to tell is not a fictional hypothetical like the others. The story I'm about to tell is a real story about a real individual and is likely one of the craziest known escape stories from North Korea into South Korea. Oh Chung-sung was a high-ranking military official in North Korea who was also an industrial engineer. He had a good job and was considered good at that job, but obviously he wasn't satisfied. And one day, he met his breaking point and was willing to risk his life for his freedom. On the morning of November 13th, 2017, Sung stole a military jeep from the military base where he worked, heading directly for the demilitarized zone, the area between North and South Korea, aiming to get into South Korea and begin a new life, in a way that is regarded as likely the most dangerous way. Although Sung did have an advantage, being military personnel, he was able to be very close to the border. He had security access and a relatively comprehensive knowledge of how things worked. Although, even with all of the knowledge in the world, you need luck and likely God on your side to even make this possible. And on this morning, Sung definitely had both. Sung sped this military jeep directly at the border, crashing through fences and driving right through no man's land. And while approaching freedom and seemingly having a perfect escape, his car lost a wheel. He hit a ditch on the side of the road and was immobile, and had to continue his escape on foot. Sung was close to the border, but he did have North Korean officials tailing him closely, and they were shooting to kill. Sung officially crossed the border, although with 5 bullet holes in his body, and was able to crawl behind a small barrier where he collapsed and stayed seemingly lifeless for hours. Later that day, the South Korean military conducted a rescue operation and strategically transported him via air to a hospital and saved his life. In the hospital, it was discovered that he was shot 5 times and lost over half of his blood, and that if he did not receive this emergency surgery, he would have died there. Sung's story is extremely well documented, and this entire situation was actually caught on camera due to the sheer amount of surveillance on the North and South Korean border. And Sung is definitely one of the luckiest people to ever cross the North Korean border illegally. If you are living in North Korea currently, well, truthfully, you're not watching this video. But if you're curious about how people have successfully and unsuccessfully escaped North Korea in the past, hopefully this video gave you a bit of context, and did so in a way that was entertaining due to the hypothetical stories that I basically just made up, but obviously based on reality, for the most part. Crazy conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. The Canadian fruit machine. The fruit machine is an ambiguous name, but if you have a keen mind, you might have had a few assumptions on what it could have been about. But if you're still in the dark, let me give you its other name, Canada's gaydar, or gay detection machine. That should paint a bit of a clearer picture. If I told you that the Canadian government in the 1960s came up with a strange device and a series of tests specifically made to identify gay men so that they could discriminate against them, you would call me crazy, right? Well, you're not alone, but unfortunately, you are wrong, and the Canadian government did exactly that. Let me explain. The whole point of this fruit machine was essentially to identify and remove homosexual men working in government roles, specifically in the military and law enforcement. During the 1960s, Dr. Frank Robert Wake developed a rather strange series of psychological tests with the purpose of, obviously, identifying gay men. How this machine actually worked was kind of hilarious and extremely rudimentary. Basically, all it would do is it would show you erotic images and say essentially gay buzzwords to see if your body had any sort of positive reaction to this stimuli. One of the markers they were looking for was a dilation of the subject's pupils, among other things. This was essentially the equivalent of a lie detector, but instead of detecting lies, it was detecting the big gay. Regardless of its ineffectiveness and rather strange methods to begin with, the results were taken seriously and led to the firing and discrimination of thousands of people, which unfortunately led to a huge rise in suicides, which is just heartbreaking. This entire project was discontinued in the late 1960s, making this entire fruit machine fiasco very short-lived, at least relatively, but the impact was still long-lasting. On top of the jobs and lives lost, the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, still continued to collect files on suspected gay people for years after this project was concluded. So if you're ever with a friend and they say, "That guy's gay, I can tell because I have gaydar," tell them, "You don't have gaydar. The Canadian government had gaydar, and they used it to discriminate, whether they were gay or not, as any little twinkling of evidence was good enough for them, and this had huge impacts." Then just sit there and awkwardly look at each other for a few minutes, and if they ask you how you knew this, you know what to tell them. Trust me, bro. The gay bomb. While we're on the topic of the big gay, I have one more for you. That being the gay bomb, which was a non-lethal chemical weapon theorized by, surprise, surprise, the United States military, specifically the Air Force. This bomb's purpose was simple yet strange. It was meant to be dropped over enemy territories, spreading a chemical mixture in the form of gas that would turn enemy troops essentially homosexual. This hypothetical weapon was confirmed in a 1994 Department of Defense document, where it spoke of a hypothetical weapon designed to dispense sexual pheromones among enemy forces to generate mutual attraction. Now, initially, I thought the military application would be that the soldiers would just be too busy loving on each other to get any fighting done, but that wasn't the case. It's actually a lot less interesting. Supposedly, the entire point was to cause confusion and panic amongst these troops, reducing their effectiveness in battle. Picture this. The year is 1993. You and your friend are sitting on the couch watching the movie Sniper, which just came out, when all of a sudden you say to your friend jokingly, "I bet the US government's probably thought about making bombs that would turn the enemies gay." You and your friend have a chuckle and continue the movie. However, the following year, you are hanging out with the same friend again, and instead of watching a movie, you are doing something that every teenager does, reading a Department of Defense release, when all of a sudden you see actual confirmation that the US Air Force was contemplating a gay bomb. After reading this, you're shocked, and you look your homie in the eyes and can't believe that your silly little joke was true. And in that moment, you and your friend start making out because you guys were gay. Alright, seriously though, the first two are a bit silly, but these get a lot more serious. Project MK Naomi. As I said, Project MK, I'm sure the word ultra was the first thing that popped into your head. And that's because most people know about that crazy true conspiracy theory. And for that reason, I wanted to add something a bit different. Project MK Naomi was actually the successor of MK Ultra, and was a collaboration between the CIA and the US Department of Defense. And it went on for almost 2 decades, from the 1950s to the 1970s. The entire goal of Project MK Naomi was to gain a deeper knowledge on chemical and biological warfare weapons, specifically to determine what substances would kill people and what chemicals would do what to people. Once the CIA and Department of Defense had a list of chemicals and a list of reactions ranging from irritation all the way to death, they then started focusing on unique delivery systems for these chemicals, most notable of which being dart guns, specifically dart guns either filled or having their tip coated with these specific chemicals, with one of the most famous examples being the heart attack gun, which was, like you may have guessed, a gun that shot a dart at a target that would, shortly after injection, cause a heart attack in the victim, making a very intentional death seem accidental. And it's no doubt that these weapons would have been very useful for spies, especially during the Cold War, when tensions and the need for a good spy was at an all-time high. And if you're for some reason unfamiliar with Project MK Ultra, it's basically the government using LSD on non-consenting individuals to try to test mind control, as a very basic elevator pitch. But I'm assuming most of you are aware of that one. USA's fake Cuban attack. This video is quickly taking a very dark turn, but that's kind of how these lists go. In 1962, during the Cold War, the US wasn't just tense with Russia, it also had growing tensions with its southern neighbor, Cuba, specifically because Fidel Castro had risen to power in Cuba and was a rather large proponent of communism, or at least kept a very good relationship with Russia. During this time, the US experienced the Cuban Missile Crisis, which simply put was Russia putting their nukes in Cuba because the US had put their nukes in Turkey and Italy. This situation was scary, but it was resolved safely. However, the US did not forget, hence them coming up with Operation Northwoods. The plan suggested that the government would carry out a series of fake terrorist attacks on the American military and civilians, to then blame Cuba for these attacks and then justify going to war. Some of these crazy actions that they planned on doing to their own people was hijacking planes, sinking boats, and even bombing US cities, all done intentionally to point the blame at Cuba. But this wasn't just a get back for the Cuban Missile Crisis. This plan was part of a larger effort to oppose Fidel Castro's communist government, which was aligned directly with the Soviet Union, the USA's enemy at the time. And with the Soviet Union having an ally so close to US soil, the US was feeling the heat. Although, would that have justified any of these actions? I don't believe so. That being said, fortunately, none of these actually happened. Although it's not because the government had a change of heart and realized this was awful. President John F. Kennedy simply rejected the plan because he thought that this would cause a large-scale war against Russia, which he deemed to be too risky. Regardless though, none of these horrible attacks injured any innocent people, which is great. And nobody even knew about it until 1997, when the documents were declassified and made public. So yeah, although the government didn't sacrifice its own people in the name of war, they definitely heavily considered it, which is definitely concerning. North Korea abducting Japanese citizens. During the late 1970s to early 1980s, there were rumors spreading around coastal Japan that North Korean agents were abducting innocent Japanese citizens and taking them back to North Korea for a plethora of reasons. This rumor even gained government attention and was simply brushed off as a conspiracy theory that had absolutely no merit. That was until it was proven to be right. Between 1977 and 1983, North Korean agents were doing exactly what I described, abducting Japanese citizens from coastal cities of Japan and taking them back to North Korea for a multitude of reasons. And these people weren't your typical abduction victim. They weren't prostitutes or homeless or anybody who seemed potentially vulnerable. They were seemingly chosen at random, making this even more scary and bizarre. The Japanese government officially recognizes over 17 victims of North Korea's abduction, although North Korea only claims they abducted 13, which to me is even crazy that they admitted to anything. But some people suggest that over hundreds of people were taken. These victims were ranging anywhere from teenagers to adults, and were kidnapped for, like I mentioned, various reasons, but were most commonly used to teach Japanese or Japanese culture to North Korean spies, so that these North Korean spies could acclimate to the culture and essentially blend right in. Besides teaching at these schools, they would also provide fake IDs for covert operations, as these people weren't going to be in Japan, so spies could take their identity and use them. The only reason that North Korea ever even admitted to any of the abductions was because after investigations by the Japanese authorities, there was simply no doubt at all that these abductions were happening and that these people were in North Korea. It was only until there was absolutely no one else to blame and nowhere else to go for North Korea that they finally admitted. Unfortunately, there really is no happy ending to this story, and the chances are that these abductions have gone on much longer and there has been many more victims than we could have ever imagined in this situation. And with the way that things are currently with North Korea, it's very likely that they will never be held accountable for literally abducting, torturing, and killing innocent Japanese citizens. The US government poisoning alcohol. It's no conspiracy theory that from 1920 to 1933, the US government banned alcohol, hence this time being known as the Prohibition era, as alcohol was literally prohibited. But besides passing laws and regulations to ensure that no alcohol was being produced or distributed, the US government also took a few additional steps to really deter people from consuming alcohol. What the government chose to do was add methyl alcohol into industrial grade alcohols to deter human consumption. It's theorized that the government assumed that having these deadly poisons in this alcohol would cause some of these illegal consumers of alcohol to pass away, deterring these bootleggers to sell their product as it was killing their customers. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case, and the bootleggers continued to sell, and alcoholics continued to drink. And unsurprisingly, as a result of this, many people were poisoned and died. And in 1927, in New York alone, there was over 41 deaths confirmed to have come from alcohol poisoning from tainted alcohol, specifically the methyl alcohol. The government used this strategy up until 1933 when the Prohibition ended, and it was at that point confirmed that the US government was literally poisoning alcohol, as it was recorded as a strategy to curb alcohol consumption. So yeah, the US was intentionally putting deadly chemicals into products that they knew that people were consuming. I find this one a bit interesting because although people weren't supposed to be consuming this, the US government knew that people were going to consume this. So the fact that they intentionally put deadly chemicals into it, to me, is a bit concerning. This might just be an optimistic thought, but I would like to believe that there's a way where you can deter people from drinking illegal industrial grade alcohol without putting literal poison poison in it that's going to undoubtedly cause death, like potentially adding an agent that is extremely sour or potentially even extremely spicy, making the alcohol essentially unconsumable as it's so uncomfortable to drink, but still rendering it non-lethal. As great as this sounds, this might have not been an option, as those sorts of additives may have rendered the actual industrial grade alcohol less effective, which wouldn't have worked because this alcohol needed to serve its primary purpose, as it wasn't meant to be consumed. It was literally industrial grade. But yeah, anyway, from 1920 to 1933, the US government decided that the best way to deter people from drinking alcohol was by killing them, or at least slowly poisoning them, which I wouldn't say is much better. The USA's fake Vietnam attack. And we're already back. Does this story sound at all familiar? But seriously though, I could make an entire separate video focusing solely on extremely deplorable things that the US government has done. But I do value living, so if you really want that video, let me know in the comments, but if not, I probably won't make it. That being said, let's get into the fake Vietnam attack. In 1964, USA was of course beefing, this time with northern Vietnam. This entire situation is known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and it marked a pivotal moment in the escalation of the US involvement in the Vietnam War. The situation happened in early August of 1964 and involved U.S. naval vessels conducting operations off the coast of North Vietnam. On August 2nd, the U.S. destroyer, the USS Maddox, was conducting intelligence patrols. And on this patrol, it encountered 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats. There's a small conflict which led the Maddox to fire warning shots at the torpedo boats and the torpedo boats to respond with an unsuccessful attack. The Maddox suffered minor damage, literally only took a single bullet hole, but the North Vietnamese torpedo boats were significantly damaged, with crew either dead or severely injured. This entire encounter happened because the North Vietnamese were pretty sussed out about covert US-backed operations happening on their coast. Regardless, this incident was relatively minor in regards to the Vietnam War as a whole. But what isn't is the alleged second attack that happened 2 days later on August 4th, 1964. It was claimed that on this day, another attack on the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy had taken place. The ships were claimed to have been targeted based on radar signals and intercepted communications between the North Vietnamese. However, with these claims seeming very plausible, there was little to no evidence and were later debunked. The captain of the USS Maddox, John Herrick, was almost instantly questioning the validity of these claims, as he was the captain and heard no such thing of this second attack. And shortly after, the entire attack was debunked and proven to be nothing more than manipulation. Investigations even confirmed that there was no North Vietnamese forces present anywhere near either of these ships that night, and the intelligence that they had misinterpreted was simply manipulated to spin the story of a potential second attack. The reason why I'm talking about this fake attack is because it was used as justification to amplify the war. Congress even passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed the US's involvement in Vietnam to escalate heavily, leading to significant troop deployments and a major intensification of the war. It wasn't until years later, after the war had ended, that the US Department of Defense admitted that the second attack never happened. And even later on, declassified documents confirmed that there was a strategic plan to use this fake second attack as a pretext to escalate the war, which ended up becoming one of the most controversial wars in US history. There's no doubt that the Vietnam War was controversial, and this is only a tiny glimpse of some of the stuff that was going on, at least on the US side of things. Project Sunshine. Fair warning, there is a reason why this entry is at the end of the list, and that's because it is by far the most morbid subject in this entire video. Project Sunshine is also known as the Dead Baby Project, and that alone should give you a small glimpse into the insanity that is this conspiracy theory proven true. Project Sunshine was a secret research project that was launched in 1953 to study the effects of radioactive fallout on human health and the environment. Already off to a bad start. The focus of this radioactive testing was specifically on strontium-90, which is regarded as the deadliest byproduct of nuclear detonation. The United States Atomic Energy Commission aimed to measure the amount of strontium-90 in human tissue, as it was typical for it to accumulate in human bones, specifically in children's bones whose skeletal systems were still developing and most vulnerable. Now here's the thing, as much as they potentially would have wanted to subject real children to strontium-90 to study the side effects, they were not able to do so, as it would be a huge moral dilemma and definitely wouldn't fly well with the general public. So what they did do was gather over 1,500 human samples, primarily consisting of babies and young children, without the consent or knowledge of the families that they were taken from. These 1,500 adolescent cadavers were not originally from the United States, and were actually from countries like Australia and the UK, and were acquired by some pretty disgusting means, specifically preventing parents from examining their deceased child before they were sent away for nuclear testing. Typically, these deceased children were sent in parts to not raise suspicion, as parents may notice their entire child missing, but they may not notice their child missing a leg if they are not able to view the child's body in its entirety. Like I mentioned at the beginning, this is extremely dark and honestly disgusting. The initial studies on strontium-90 only analyzed the effects on the human remains. However, shortly after, it expanded to studying its effects on natural environments, such as soil, grass, and grazing animals, where they were seeing what the effect of this strontium-90 would be as it ascended up the food chain. I don't think it'll serve as much as a surprise that once the practices of Project Sunshine were exposed, they were met with widespread outrage and even resulted in a stricter ethical standard when it came to scientific research, specifically those involving human subjects, dead or alive. It literally sounds like something your crazy uncle would say at Thanksgiving dinner. Hey, can you pass the potatoes? Yeah, here you go. Oh, did you know that in the 50s, the US government was actually essentially stealing dead children from overseas and using them to test the dangerous byproducts of nuclear fallout? Oh, crazy. Honestly though, it sounds too crazy to be true, but one thing I've learned from researching for this video is that, unfortunately, some things are too crazy to not be true. The Tuskegee study. There's a saying that goes, if something is free, then you're probably the product. And that is something that holds very true when it comes to the Tuskegee study. The Tuskegee study was a very disturbing and deceptive study that took place in Tuskegee, Alabama. The study specifically targeted black males and how having an untreated disease would affect them. If you're curious about what that disease may be, then perhaps the other name for this study may lend a hint. The Tuskegee study is also known as the Tuskegee syphilis study. Yeah. This study initially took place from 1929 to 1931 and had relatively innocent intentions. During this time, the Rosen World Fund, a fund that essentially promoted healthcare and education to poor African American farmers, specifically about sexually transmitted diseases. The goal of this initial study was to identify the southern counties in Alabama with the highest rates of syphilis among African American males. At this time, the goal was to simply find this location and find the people within this location that had syphilis and then treat them. Still seeming relatively innocent. This pursuit was successful, and they found that Macon County in Alabama had the highest rate of male syphilis, with over 35% of men being infected with syphilis. Although near the end of 1931 is where this all takes a very dark turn, as during this time the Great Depression was in full swing, and the Rosenwald Fund, which was looking to help the poor African American community, was running out of funding. It was at this point when the Public Health Service, a part of the United States government, approached the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama to see if they would be willing to continue the study, specifically researching the effects of untreated syphilis in African American males. But they only proposed that they monitor these untreated people for 6 to 9 months to gather data and then at that point treat them fully. Remember this timeline, because we'll be referencing this later. The Tuskegee Institute agreed to do this research as they thought it was beneficial, not only for their local population, but for all Americans. And it was shortly after, in 1932, when the study began. The study began with 600 men being enrolled into the study. 399 of these men had syphilis, 201 of these men did not. Things already take a dark turn here, as all 600 of these men were more or less kept in the dark about what this study exactly was about, and they were really only being told that they were getting free healthcare, something that was hard to come by and an appetizing offer for anybody suffering from any sort of disease. Right? Not only did the government say that they were going to give them free healthcare, they also said that they were going to treat these men of their bad blood, which isn't really a medical condition. It was more or less of a local blanket term that just described general illness. Most of them weren't even necessarily diseases themselves, but symptoms, such as fatigue, body pains, anemia, and even undiagnosed syphilis symptoms as well. These 600 men were specifically promised free medical exams, meals covered by the government, and even burial insurance in case they died during the study. That alone should have seemed like a red flag, but at this time it seemed like a deal that was too good to be true, which is potentially another red flag. So consider that 2 red flags. But back to the point. For the men in this study who were confirmed to have syphilis, the government didn't tell them about their diagnosis, and they didn't even give them any treatment either. Now, at this point, you might be asking, why didn't the government simply find people that they knew had syphilis and then simply request that they have the ability to monitor them? These people already had syphilis, and the US government was willing to incentivize them, so why not inform them about the data that you're collecting? The government claimed they took a deceptive path because it was the only way that these men would have stayed in the study, and for the study to work, they needed to be closely monitored consistently over time. But it's heavily suspected that this deception was based on a lack of respect. both because of racial and economic prejudice, specifically because the study only involved black men, all of which who were poor farmers, which meant they had limited resources and almost no education as well too. And by limited education, I mean very limited, like fully illiterate. So if you're an educated and prejudiced doctor during this time, why would you give these people any real information? Just keep them in the dark. They don't know any better, right? That doesn't sound ethical to me, but I suppose that was their mindset. So at this point, you may be thinking, sure, okay, the US government wasn't fully upfront and maybe wasn't even respectful to these people that they were studying, but so what? It's not like they gave these people syphilis. These people had syphilis. All they were doing was collecting data. And while I personally would say that there is a ton of ethical issues within that already, that is not the worst part about this study. That is only the beginning of this study. After the initial 9 months that this study was supposed to go on, they decided to extend the study and extend it again. And in 1934, the first major paper about the study of untreated syphilis was made public. And if you're thinking that now that there's a paper and they can end the study and finally treat these men, you're unfortunately mistaken. And it was at this point when the study was extended once again. And there was even a push from the medical community not to treat these men, but to actually prevent these men from getting treatment so they could see the prolonged effects of syphilis. And this is where we get to the darkest part of this study. The study actually went on for 40 years. And for a majority of that 40-year period, there was actually an extremely effective and safe treatment available. That being penicillin, which was first used to treat infections in 1930, and by 1945, it was accepted as a proper treatment for syphilis. But of course, these men were kept in the dark about that, and were never offered it or even informed about it. And the government simply just decided to watch these men wither away, to see how this infection affected daily life over an extremely long period of time. By the end of the study, it was estimated that 128 of the men in the study died directly from the syphilis that they had. 40 of the men in this study also infected their wives, and 19 of these men had children that were born with syphilis. Those numbers especially are extremely disheartening because those people didn't even sign up for this deceptive study. They were simply the unintentional victim of the unintentional victim. And a lot of these deaths and infections could have easily been prevented by treating these people like they planned on doing. But instead, they decided to simply withhold treatment and monitor them for 40 years. Something that I think any reasonable person would agree is unethical and honestly horrible. Medical studies require consent, and the patients in the study need to be fully informed of the risks and also treatments available, and they need to be treated with respect. And with the Tuskegee study, none of those measures were taken, and it's truly a dark and shameful part of American medical history. But there is a silver lining to this story, as on July 25th, 1972, a journalist named Jean Heller broke the story about the horrific study that had been going on for the last 40 years. And with this news breaking, the government then decided that this study was ethically unjustified, and that also meant that it was immediately canceled. And the following year, there was actually a class action lawsuit that was filed on behalf of these men who were unknowingly a part of the study, and they did end up winning $9.5 million in 1973 money. So keep in mind, it's adjusted for inflation, it's around $50 million today. I'm sure for some, this money was extremely helpful and went a long way, but many of the participants never even knew that they were part of a study, never saw this money, and simply died because they didn't know what they signed up for. And even if you did live to get part of this settlement, not only is your body worse for wear for never getting treatment for a disease that they knew you had, but you also likely have no trust in the government, as they just spent the last 40 years treating you like a lab rat, and the few dollars that they were forced to throw at you only feels like too little too late. So yeah, the Tuskegee study started by simply trying to identify counties with the highest syphilis population to begin treatment, and ended with a 40-year study that completely violated not only the human rights of the participants, or should I say victims, but also the medical system as a whole. And as upsetting and disturbing as the story is, at least there was some sort of closure associated with it. This is only the first entry on this list, and we have lots more to cover. The Watergate scandal. When I first heard the name of this conspiracy theory or situation, I was convinced that it had something to do with the US government putting something in the water. But as you may know, that's not the case at all. And interestingly, this scandal is also the reason why a lot of other scandals have gate in their name, such as Deflategate, Elsagate, and a lot of other scandals that range from morbid to disturbing. So let's give a bit of context before we get into the details of this Watergate. Richard Nixon was the 37th president of the United States. He was an author, a lawyer, and a career politician. But in 1974, his presidency was cut short as he resigned for reasons that involve the Watergate scandal. This entire scandal is interesting and kind of two-sided because there is the initial acts that took place, and then there is the reaction to the exposure of the initial actions. And if you're already confused, don't worry, because I'm going to lay it out simply as possible. This entire situation begins with Richard Nixon being paranoid that he was not going to win a re-election, something that he feared deeply and was willing to do anything to avoid. This included harassing opposing journalists, politicians, and even celebrities who could potentially influence his re-election in a negative way. And he and his administration would harass them by abusing government power in ways such as auditing them and even getting them involved in strange legal disputes and more. But that's only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the situation. Prior to the 1972 election, the election that Nixon was so fearful of losing, a group of Nixon's associated formed the Creeps. Creeps meaning the Committee to Re-elect the President. An odd and kind of fitting name. This rather elusive group went to some extreme and even illegal measures to ensure that their goal was met. One of their biggest efforts was collecting information on the opposing party, the Democratic Party. And this is where we get to Watergate. This group of creeps were approved to break into and plant listening devices into the Democratic National Committee headquarters, which just so happened to be based in the Watergate office building in Washington, D.C. The group figured that if they could break into their offices and collect data secretly, they could find some dirt and use it against them to make sure that they win the 1972 election. The first time these creeps broke into the office, the mission was successful. However, on their second attempt, all 5 of these men were caught. And this is where the plot thickens. Because nobody knew who these men were, what their motivation was, and what their goal was. All they knew is that there was 5 spies breaking into the Democratic Party's headquarters. Although it's not hard to think of who may have potentially ordered this attack. The FBI began to look deeply into this case to find who exactly was involved and what their motivation and goal was. It was at this point, coincidentally, when Richard Nixon would instruct the CIA to tell the FBI to halt all further investigation on this entire scandal, or at least the finances involved behind the scandal. They were still going to investigate these men, but the funding investigation was blocked. Obviously, this entire situation sparked public outrage, and there was a lot of finger pointing at the Republican Party, specifically at the president himself. And although he and his party strictly denied any involvement or awareness of this essentially spy operation, information was flowing in and the house of cards was crumbling. One of the early pieces of evidence that pointed towards Nixon was the fact that one of these men who conducted this robbery was actually a Republican aide. And on top of that, they had an informant who was feeding them information directly connecting these burglars to Richard Nixon himself. And I swear I'm not even making it up, this informant or whistleblower went by the alias of Deep Throat. Shout out Deep Throat for the information. I feel like if you called the government right now and told them you had information, but you wanted to go by the name Deep Throat, you'd probably get hung up on, but that's just me. Now, despite all of this media attention and this obviously odd situation going on, Nixon did obviously win the election in 1972. However, that was short-lived. The following year in 1973, 4 of Nixon's top aides lost their job because they were involved directly in the cover-up. Through months and months of consistent investigations, there was only more and more dots being connected and lines being drawn directly back to Richard Nixon from these burglars and from this entire scandal. And while everything was still relatively unconfirmed, it became more and more plausible that Richard Nixon not only knew about this situation, but was also directly involved. And it was at this point as well when Richard Nixon's own assistant broke the news that Richard Nixon had installed spy devices all around the White House. And while his intentions aren't fully known, I would assume he did this to benefit himself. And unfortunately for him, these recording devices actually became his downfall, as they were able to prove his involvement. When Nixon's assistant broke the news in court that these devices were installed, the government instantly subpoenaed these devices to hear the recordings that he had captured. And of course, Nixon honored the subpoena and handed over these recording devices, right? No, obviously not. He not only denied to hand them over, but he also exercised an executive privilege, stating that the president should have some right to privacy, which obviously isn't what this was about at all. Eventually, these tapes were handed over, and after thoroughly being reviewed, it was confirmed that Richard Nixon knew exactly what was going on and was even providing hush money to these creeps. The the president had two options: resign or be impeached. And as we know, on August 8th, 1974, he resigned as the United States president. This entire situation put people in jail, changed laws, and also changed US politics forever, as it was the first ever resignation of a president in the history of the United States. This conspiracy or scandal may not seem extremely shocking at this point, because I feel like nowadays trust in the government is at an all-time low, but that wasn't always the case. And there was a point in time when people had trust and respect for the powers that be and believed that they had integrity. This situation is undeniably bad, as it's a blatant abuse of power and is a demonstration of a president fighting dirty for his own gain. And while justice was served and there was a happy ending to this story, the situation really only exposed likely something that was already going on. So yeah, the president wanted to maintain his power, did some shady things to collect some information to win the presidency, but what's considered worst of all is the fact that he not only denied and lied about the situation, but also used executive orders to prevent the truth from being revealed. Regardless, people in these high positions of power should be held to a high standard, and integrity and honesty should come first. And I hope someday we can return to that. But yeah, let's keep going. Project MKUltra. MKUltra is one of the most notorious and disturbing covert operations in all of US history. And it's for that reason that I'm going to keep this section pretty brief and try my best to make sure that I really only focus on information that you may not have heard yet if you're already familiar. This entire conspiracy theory had one single goal: to explore the methods of mind control and behavioral manipulation in humans. The reason this operation even started was because after the Korean War, American prisoners of war who were being returned home seemed to have been brainwashed, as they were consistently repeating what they believed to be communist propaganda. To the American government, this was very concerning, because they assumed this had to be the result of brainwashing from their communist opposition, which meant that if these communists had mind control techniques that the Americans didn't, then they had an advantage over America. And obviously this meant that they needed to develop their own mind control techniques, or at least explore how they would go about it. Already, we're on a pretty disturbing note, but this really does only get worse from here. It was after this discovery when the CIA, which was relatively new at the time, was given $25 million to perform psychiatric experiments on humans. At the time, this was the most hidden and secretive project that the CIA and the US government as a whole was performing. And it'll become pretty obvious why when we get into the details. The government was finding patients at psychiatric hospitals, prisoners from federal prisons, and even random members of the public. And what they would do is dose them with drugs without their awareness and then do experiments on them to see how the drugs affected them. One of the most interesting and notable operations in MKUltra was an operation known as Operation Midnight Climax, which has an oddly fitting name, and essentially consisted of the US government building safe houses. And what these safe houses were essentially fake plant houses where US government funded prostitutes would lure men into these houses and then dose them with LSD where they were being observed, typically behind a two-way mirror in that very safe house. In the last section, we talked about creeps in the government, but this brings it to a whole nother level. Not only were they paying prostitutes to lure men to essentially trapped houses, they would also dose them with drugs without their consent and experiment on them. But that's still only the tip of the iceberg. Another interesting thing that they did was hosting LSD parties, which was essentially a party where music was played and LSD was unknowingly given to the participants of this party. And these scientists would simply observe these people on LSD to see how they would react. And it's believed that these ongoing tests were actually a precursor to the hippie movement, or at least part of it, which is interesting. But MKUltra wasn't just prostitutes and partying. There was a lot of medical mismanagement, most famously at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada, where patients with relatively minor ailments would be taken advantage of and experimented on with aggressive drug cocktails. The main doctor at this institute, known as Dr. Cameron, pursued a concept that he called depatterning, and this concept and practice was truly evil. The goal of this practice was to reduce patients to an infantile psychological state, essentially giving an adult the mind of a child. And the point of bringing people to the state was so that the government could take advantage of this extremely vulnerable position and from that point rebuild their mind, giving them an entirely new psyche, thought process, mindset, and belief system to essentially control this person fully. Besides dosing these people with drugs, they would also put these people into comas and play messages over and over again until they sunk deep into the person's subconscious. And they even performed electroshock therapy and other forms of extreme therapy on these people as well. Disturbingly, this entire project went on for 20 years, from 1953 to 1973. And while it's not known the true number of people that were unknowingly experimented on by the US government in this 20-year period, it's likely safe to assume that there was hundreds, if not thousands, of victims of this disturbing study, many of which who were simply never the same, for reasons that they would never understand why. If you're experienced with drugs, then you likely understand how bad it is to have a bad trip, and you likely understand how detrimental it could be for someone who's never had a psychedelic experience to have an unknowing dose put upon them. That experience, for many, is likely completely mind-altering and also extremely terrifying, and it's quite disturbing how many people this had happened to. Although, once again, there is some sort of happy ending, I suppose, as in 1973, the operation was closed, once again by a whistleblower, although this time the whistleblower's name wasn't Deep Throat. His name was actually 69 Lord. I'm just joking. His name was John Marks, and he wrote a book named The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, where he exposed most of the operation. And at that point, after this information had been exposed, congressional hearings began to investigate what was really going on. And it was through those hearings where the CIA not only admitted that the operation existed, but they also were forced to admit what they were doing. To this day, there has been no class action lawsuit, no apology, nothing. And the children of some of these victims are still pursuing legal action against the institutes that they deem responsible. And personally, I hope justice is truly served, as awareness and exposure is one thing, but justice goes beyond just that. It's so ironic that after the Korean War, the US government publicly exposed and shamed these communist countries for their mind control techniques and how they could possibly brainwash prisoners of war and torture them. But almost immediately after giving a speech about how horrible these things are, they then begin not only researching their own methods of doing the exact same thing, but they go about it in likely the worst way possible. And Project MKUltra is a massive example of the US government breaking moral, ethical, and legal laws in their own self-interest, and it's one that people have not forgotten, nor should they ever. What do you guys think? Feel free to let me know in the comments. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video was made because of your overwhelming interest and support in the comments of the last video. So I just quickly wanted to make the same offer again. If you guys liked this video and would like me to make a part 2 about crazy conspiracies that the US government has been involved in, then please leave a comment telling me that you want part 2. I try to read as many comments as possible, and I take your guys' suggestions seriously. So yeah, I thought I'd just mention that quickly. But without further ado, let's get to the last entry of this list: the Iran-Contra affair. The US is still very much in a Cold War against Russia, and is still very much so anti-communist. And it was at this time when the president, Ronald Reagan, promised to support anti-communist insurgencies around the world. Meaning that if you were a country that was currently dealing with a potential rise in communism or the threat of communism, the US had your back to make sure that that wasn't a problem. Typically by providing arms, or at the very least, training. Reagan was particularly interested in a group known as the Contras, and this group was at war with another group within Nicaragua, known as the Sandinistas. The biggest difference between these two groups was the fact that the Sandinistas was a communist group, and they were backed by Cuba. The president, Ronald Reagan, saw the Contras as a noble force, and even equated them to being similar to the founding fathers as they were fighting for freedom. Now this is where things begin to get sticky. The Contras were funding their war primarily through the drug trade, and because of this, the American government actually passed an amendment known as the Boland Amendment, preventing the US government from providing the Contras with any support due to their involvement in the drug trade. So far, this is pretty straightforward and seems reasonable enough. However, it was at this point when Ronald Reagan decided that he didn't want to follow this amendment and continued to support the Contras regardless of the amendment. And how they did this is a bit confusing, as where they went next was Iran. At the time, in 1985, Iran had 7 American hostages that they were keeping in Lebanon, and Reagan wanted to do everything he could to make sure that these hostages came home alive. It was at this point when the government made a deal. The US government, with Reagan's approval, agreed to give Iran weapons in exchange for the release of the hostages. It's important to note that this was all happening behind closed doors, because publicly, Reagan was saying that he would not negotiate with terrorists, and there was even a trade embargo currently going on with Iran at the time. But that's still only where things begin, as the US government technically budgeted $30 million to go to Iran for this terrorist negotiation, although it was shortly after exposed that only $12 million of this $30 million actually went to Iran, and the remaining $18 million actually went to support the Contras, a group that the US government was not allowed to support. This is a bit of a double whammy, because not only was the government negotiating with terrorists, something that they said they would not be doing, but they were also supporting a group that they were not allowed to support. And this was all exposed by a Lebanese journalist in 1986, and the fallout of this is where we truly see the impact of the entire situation. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who was in charge of most of these operations, came clean about his involvement and said that he knew it happened, he was part of it, and he also admitted that Reagan knew about all of it. This testimony from the colonel and pressure from journalists caused investigations to be launched against Reagan, not just at the time, but for the entirety of his presidency from that point on. And after these investigations, it was ruled that Reagan's involvement was more or less benign and was simply due to a lack of oversight, and because of this, he was not implicated directly, meaning he wasn't in trouble. At least until 1987, when Reagan finally testified on this entire matter. And while these hearings went on for 41 days and were publicly televised, Reagan would still not face any consequences. However, that wasn't the case for everybody. 12 people involved in this conspiracy were charged and found guilty. Those people being Robert McFarlane, Colonel Oliver North, 4 CIA officers, 5 government contractors, and Reagan's national security advisor, John Poindexter. Undoubtedly, this entire situation stained Reagan's image as a president and as an honest man. However, surprisingly, he was never impeached, never resigned, and actually left office with one of the highest approval ratings in US history, which to me either seems that people were uninformed about the situation or simply agreed with what happened, although it wasn't legal. Not only did it expose a level of distrust for the government, like in Watergate, but it also resulted in the US government literally giving an opposing terrorist organization $12 million out of a hypothetical $30 million that was supposed to be given to them, which I think a lot of people would consider to be a conflict of interest. And while obviously getting hostages home is important, giving them a proposed $30 million of weaponry seems a bit counterintuitive. Combine that to secretly funneling money to an organization that is currently trying to overthrow the Nicaraguan government that is funded by the drug trade, that's an entirely different can of worms as well too. And whether or not you think these actions were justified or moral, that's a decision that you have to make for yourself. But the point is the fact that the government was lying directly to the face of the people and doing things that they likely would have not voted towards or supported, which some would consider to be unlawful, unmoral, and unethical. And if the person you're supposed to trust is saying one thing to your face and then behind closed doors doing essentially the exact opposite, it's not a good look for the trust and faith in the institution that you're running. Operation Acoustic Kitty. During the Cold War as a whole, and specifically during the spy craze, the US government invested a lot of money into unique intelligence collection methods. One of the more interesting examples is Operation Acoustic Kitty. This operation had a simple premise and hilariously failed almost instantly. And it's for that reason that I wanted to discuss it first. Essentially, the plan behind this operation was that the US government was going to gather cats, train them, and then implant recording devices within these cats so that they could passively record any intelligence. And these cats would be trained to specifically hang out around sensitive areas. For example, outside government buildings, windowsills of important offices, social places that important people may hang out, and stuff along those lines. The theory was that if these cats were simply present in places where secret conversations were taking place, nobody would question a cat being around, and nobody would have their guard up against that. Little did they know, the cat would secretly be recording their information, feeding intelligence directly to the CIA. On paper, it kind of almost makes sense because, I mean, think about it. Everybody, when they see a cat in public, talks to it. And who knows? Some people, when they're down on the luck, they talk to their pets, they describe their life to their pets. So potentially, if there was a Russian spy hanging out near Washington, D.C., and he was just having a bad day, maybe he would have saw a stray cat and, told it exactly what it was planning to do. Definitely seems a bit far-fetched, but compared to some of the stuff that the US government did during this time, it almost seems extremely rational. Now, this is where things get kind of hilarious, because although the plan was strange but potentially logical, the entire operation almost instantly fell apart when it came to development. For starters, this entire operation cost over $10 million, which adjusted for inflation in today's currency is over $80 million. And that's just to train a single cat, just one cat, mind you. The majority of this budget went towards developing the specific recording device that could be implanted within the cat, as well as developing the proper surgical techniques to perform the implant of this recording device into the cat. And then finally, the rest of the budget went into directly training this cat. Now, on a serious note though, I can only imagine how many cats died during the research and development of this entire ordeal, so moment of silence for those cats. But back to the implantation. The government didn't just implant a recording device into these cats, they also tried to make a half cat, half cyborg machine, because the CIA realized that these were just cats with microphones in them, and they needed more assistants to be better equipped spies. So not only did they implant recording devices into these cats, but they also implanted the equivalent of wires and batteries within these cats to help make them more attentive. And the reason why they actually did this was because during testing and training, initially they realized that these cats were not going to be helpful spies. And quite often, during long days of training, the cats would simply get bored and either go and sleep or go and eat mid-testing. And that was something that the CIA didn't appreciate. So every time that their test cat would become unfocused and do something that a normal cat would do, they decided to implant another wire to hopefully reprogram the cat's brain to make it a better spy. But even with all of these hiccups, the CIA decided to do some real-life field testing with their new cat spy, as they figured if they invested this much, they might as well at least try it. And it was at that point, after the CIA spent nearly $10 million on a single cat, that they took this cat to a park, where they released into a park with the intention of having the cat overhear a conversation between two men that they planted on a park bench. The CIA had a surveillance van beside the park where it was monitoring the entire situation, and upon this first test, the cat did not walk up to the park bench or hang out around any people at all. The cat essentially was dropped into the park, walked forward, and then walked directly into oncoming traffic and died. And with the untimely and tragic death of this cat, Project Acoustic Kitty died as well. And this project is kind of funny, but at the same time upsetting, because at least one cat died, and I can only imagine how many cats they tested their implants and experimental surgeries on, so. Oh, and did I mention that this video gets darker as the list goes on? Yeah, this is the most tame entry on this list. Let's keep going. The BCCI scandal. The BCCI, or Bank of Credit and Commerce International, was a global bank that was founded in 1972 by a Pakistani financier. This bank claimed to offer an anti-colonial alternative to Western banks. Its ultimate mission was to break financial barriers for third world countries. But in reality, this bank used fluffy buzzwords to cover up billions of dollars worth of bank fraud. Let me explain. In its first 10 years of business, the BCCI was growing rapidly, and it had over 4,000 branches in 78 countries and had assets valued at over $20 billion USD. And at this time, it was the 7th largest private bank in the world. Pretty impressive, and once again, noble, because they're just here to help out the little guys, right? Well, unfortunately, their image didn't last long, because large banks, specifically Western banks and other financial institutions, became very suspect of the success of BCCI. And during the 1980s, financial regulators and intelligence agencies began to express their concerns that BCCI may be poorly regulated, to put it kindly. And not too long after these concerns began bubbling, investigations began and revealed the true purpose of BCCI. And the fact that this bank was involved in a massive money laundering scheme, as well as multiple other financial crimes. And not only that, but was also intentionally and successfully illegally gaining a controlling interest in a major American bank, something it was not allowed to do. In 1991, almost 20 years after BCCI was founded, it became the focal point of a massive regulatory battle. And on July 5th of that year, bank regulators in 7 different countries raided and locked down branch offices during an operation that was known as Operation Sea Chase. And during the investigations that followed this operations, investigators from the US and the UK determined that the BCCI wasn't set up to help the little guy, but it was set up deliberately to avoid centralized regulatory review and operated strategically in bank secrecy jurisdictions, where they do not need to disclose the same amount of information that Western banks may need to. Due to the lack of regulation, this bank had become the global hub for money laundering, which directly benefited and supported terrorist groups and massive drug lords globally. And on top of that, the BCCI was literally a Ponzi scheme that was run by its executives. And in 1991, when the bank was officially defunct, over $10 million were stolen directly from customers of this bank and simply never accounted for. The bank that simply wanted to get away from Western banks and help the little guy and break financial barriers for third world countries actually just ran a massive Ponzi scheme that not only subsidized terrorism, dictatorship, and drug trade, but also literally stole billions of dollars from their customer base as well too. The tactics used by BCCI are still used today in more recent massive Ponzi schemes, like for example, FTX, both of which were giant Ponzi schemes that acted outside of the US government's jurisdiction. And I'm not saying that the US government should control all financial activity, but shady players definitely love to avoid US regulation. And while being defrauded out of billions by your bank sounds awful, it's still not nearly as bad as some of the entries on this list. The FBI spying on John Lennon. We're already back to the Cold War. During this time, a lot of stuff went down, so expect to hear about it a lot in my conspiracy series. Regardless, during this time, there was a battle of ideologies taking place. Capitalism versus communism. And during this time, in the 1960s and 1970s, communism was growing in popularity domestically within the US. And this fear sparked the US government to start a program known as COINTELPRO. And while I could make an entirely separate video only describing the happenings of COINTELPRO, I thought I would give a brief description and focus on one of the unique happenings. Specifically, the reason why they spied on John Lennon and other celebrities at the time. The US government saw the growing popularity of communism as a domestic threat that was set on destroying the country from within. And because of this, they thought the best course of action was to spread negative propaganda against those sharing communist ideologies. One of the more famous examples of this was John Lennon. Specifically when he moved to the US in the 1970s. He was one of the most famous people in the world at the time, and he was very outspoken politically, which made him a target for the FBI's surveillance, specifically because they feared his influence on young voters. Ordered by J. Edgar Hoover, Lennon was closely monitored by the FBI and was even threatened with deportation over his political views. Now, obviously, COINTELPRO did a lot more than just spy on John Lennon, but I thought it was an interesting point to focus on for this short segment. But beyond the debatable motivations of COINTELPRO, it was unsurprisingly operating illegally, primarily undermining the First Amendment rights of civilians. There is actually a leaked COINTELPRO memo that proposed a plan to expose the secret pregnancy of famous actress Jean Seberg because she was a financial supporter of the Black Panther Party, a party that was pushing Marxist-Leninist ideals. And the reason why the FBI wanted to expose this pregnancy was because it could possibly cause her embarrassment or tarnish her image with the general public. Now, keep in mind, at the time, it wasn't fully confirmed or even known that the government was literally spying on and actively discrediting those with communist views. But some people had a suspicion. And although in 1972, Richard Nixon won the election, the entire operation of COINTELPRO was exposed. And these expositions led to a congressional investigation into exactly what the FBI was doing with COINTELPRO. And this investigation, fortunately, exposed exactly what the FBI was doing and led to massive reforms within the intelligence community, primarily by reducing the FBI's power as a whole. And it was with that congressional hearing that the COINTELPRO program was ended, although it did still operate from 1956 all the way up until 1971. So yeah, COINTELPRO operated for almost 20 years uninterrupted, specifically spying on influential people who shared communistic views. And while one notable example is the fact that they spied on John Lennon and tried to have him deported, and maybe did other things, this entire operation actively spied and discredited hundreds of people, and then some. The CIA trafficking cocaine. This story's wild and takes a few turns, so buckle up. Our story begins in Panama, a relatively small country, but a country that is extremely vital to the US military and global economy, specifically because of its canal, the Panama Canal. Throughout the 20th century, America actually ran the Panama Canal directly, with military bases spread across the entire canal. And this was strategic for the US government because during this time, once again in the Cold War, the USA was specifically concerned with Russia trying to get a bit friendly with South America. And because of that, the Panama Canal was a good checkpoint to make sure that everything was going to America's liking. And because of how strategic the Panama Canal was to America, America and Panama had a very good relationship. Now this is where things get interesting, because at the time, the head of military intelligence in Panama was Manuel Noriega, someone who was previously trained by the FBI in general technical skills and leadership skills, something that America did for a lot of South American leaders to gain favor, essentially thinking that if they could train South American countries how to have strong leaders, they would be more faithful to America, the country that taught them how to have stronger leadership. And Panama was no different. But like I said, this is where things get sticky, because Noriega was an asset to the American government because he was actively controlling the Panama Canal through his position as the military intelligence leader. But he was also playing both sides of the field, because not only was he acting essentially as a spy for the US government, but he was also acting in his own self-interest as a drug smuggler, specifically by providing protection to drug shipments going from South America to North America, and globally. Now this is a conundrum, similar to the Iran-Contra affair, which I discussed in the last conspiracy theory video. But in regards to this situation, the government is actively having an ally who is helping them, but is also actively protecting drug smugglers from his own country and other South American countries, and essentially letting them traffic their drugs onto American soil. The question is, did America know, and how much did they know? And while we can't know for sure, it's heavily assumed that the government knew exactly what was going on, and not only allowed it, but also protected it. I feel like there's no way the US government wasn't aware of this, because in 1972, the US government actually planned on potentially assassinating Noriega because of the smuggling that was going on. But they didn't, because they deemed he was too much of an asset. It makes you wonder, because why would they consider assassinating an asset if they weren't doing anything wrong? Unless, of course, they knew they were doing something wrong, which was later exposed. That was until 1989. As time went on, Noriega became less and less useful to the US government as the Cold War came to a close and the war on drugs began to grow. and Noriega was becoming less of an asset and more of a liability and a target. And because of this, in 1989, the US government liberated Panama to relieve it of its dictator, Manuel Noriega, which is ironic because this is the exact same person that the US government was subsidizing, essentially. And not only that, this liberation was ordered by the president at the time, George H.W. Bush, who was also previously the head of the CIA, the agency that literally had Noriega on salary. Anyways, Noriega was eventually caught after a pretty bloody battle that happened in Panama, and the rest is history. The US government allowed a drug-dealing dictator to have full control of Panama because he was helpful in providing intelligence to the US government. But once the US government didn't require this intelligence anymore, and this military dictator got a bit too much power, the US government decided that it was the perfect time to liberate Panama once it was convenient for them. Makes you wonder. And somehow, we still have more to discuss. The false positives scandal. This case is truly disturbing and actually doesn't involve the US government. It's not a mystery or a conspiracy that some South American countries struggle with dangerous groups typically associated with drugs, gaining power and influence typically via violence. Naturally, the government wants no opposition of power, and besides this, they definitely don't want people terrorizing their own citizens. And it's for that reason that the Venezuelan and Colombian governments began fighting against these groups. Specifically, in this example, the Colombian government was fighting guerrilla forces of the FARC and the ELN. Two of the primary groups fighting against the Colombian government starting as early as 1964. But this conspiracy actually has nothing to do with these insurgency groups and has everything to do with the Colombian military. While these internal conflicts were happening, some members of the Colombian military decided that it would be a bright idea to, instead of finding and defeating their enemy, they could simply find and defeat vulnerable people and display their bodies and count those kills as success for their movement. If I'm being vague, let me make it extremely clear. Members of the military and even civilians would lure typically poor or mentally impaired civilians to remote parts of the country, offering them work, saying, hey, do you want to work here? There's a work opportunity. And instead of there being a work opportunity, the military would then kill these people and present their bodies to the authorities saying, hey, look at all these opposing forces that we killed. We're doing a really good job fighting the war on drugs, the war on terror. You should give me a promotion. You should give me other benefits. And this wasn't a one-off case. This was something that actively took place for many years. And in 2021, the jurisdiction of peace in Colombia reported the total number of victims to be over 6,400 people between 2002 and 2008, just that 6-year span. They also believe that there was over 10,000 victims between the years of 2002 and 2010. But keep in mind, there was investigations into these practices going back as early as 1988. So the total confirmed number could be way higher. This is honestly insane to think that these military members were not focused on fighting the enemy that they had. They would simply murder innocent civilians to inflate their success, for them to feel like they're doing a good job and hopefully get a few more bucks. Insane. Bayer spreading HIV. If the name Bayer instantly doesn't ring a bell, then the name aspirin definitely should. And this is another conspiracy that actually has nothing to do with the American government or any government at all. But it's likely one of the most horrific examples of a conspiracy that took place in the private sector. Bayer is a German pharmaceutical giant, and like I mentioned, is most known for aspirin. However, Bayer faced a massive scandal in the 1980s when one of its subsidiaries, Cutter Biology, was producing blood clotting products. Now, obviously, producing medicine and medical products is not a conspiracy or a crime. So what did they do? Well, here's the deal. The blood clotting products that they were making to help hemophiliacs actually ended up infecting thousands of hemophiliacs with HIV. This happened because the blood clotting product that Cutter Biology was developing required blood from donors in order to be made. And Cutter Biology was using blood from high-risk donors in order to save money when producing this product. And surprise, surprise, some of this blood that they were selling at scale was contaminated with HIV. And because of this, many hemophiliacs who were taking Bayer's medication were unknowingly diagnosed with HIV. This by itself is disturbing and truly upsetting, but it doesn't quite end there. Because there was already so many questions, like why are they using high-risk blood in something that is literally going to be affecting somebody's blood? And how do they not consider this being an outcome if they knew that they were using high-risk blood? But once this product was exposed for contaminating innocent people with HIV, the US government instantly demanded that Bayer stop selling its products within the US, which it did. Although at this point, thousands were already infected. And while Bayer did stop selling in the US, they didn't stop selling elsewhere. Bayer actually developed another product using safer blood, no-risk blood, and they sold them in Western markets. Yet, at this time, when they had developed a safer version of this product and knew that their old product was still giving people HIV, they sold their updated product in Western markets, but they still continued to sell their old product in these South American and Asian countries where they knew they were actively infecting people with HIV. Bayer continuing to sell these products resulted in around 20,000 people being infected with HIV, and it's one of the most blatant examples of corporate corruption and misconduct. After infecting tens of thousands of people and killing hundreds and thousands of people through the infection that they gave people, obviously justice was served, right? No. Not one person at Bayer or Cutter Biological served any time in prison or was given any personal repercussions. Bayer as a corporation paid a $600 million settlement, which was brought by thousands of American hemophiliacs, although that only gives some money to some Americans that were affected. Although the number sounds big, it's truly a slap on the wrist for killing thousands of people and profiting on it too. Isn't that a happy note? Project Hemisphere. If you're watching this video, you likely know what a wiretap is, right? Maybe you watched a movie about mafia bosses or drug lords and the police are trying to get information on them and they tap their phone. That's a real thing, and in those situations, that's a useful tool. But what if I told you the American government actually had a partnership with the third largest cell provider in all of the United States to track all of their customers' data? Well, hopefully you'd believe me because it's true, and it's called Project Hemisphere. In 2007, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, the ONDCP, started a partnership with the cell phone provider AT&T, the third largest cell provider in the entire United States. And this partnership was for profit, meaning that the US government was not only gaining access to all of AT&T's data, which we'll get into exactly what that contains, but they are literally selling the information directly to the United States government. But this isn't just a high-level operation. Sheriff's offices and police departments across all of the United States each individually pay anywhere from $1 million per year plus to maintain access to all of AT&T's records. And they're paying this much because obviously this information is valuable to the authorities. But there's a lot of questions. How long has this been going on? What do they use this information for? What information do they get access to? And is this legal, and did anybody even agree to this? Let me answer all of those questions in that order. Project Hemisphere as a project dates back all the way back until 1987, with the US government using other methods to collect data based off of telephone conversations, likely partnering with other landline and communication companies of the time. And while AT&T only became part of Project Hemisphere during 2007 and was exposed in 2013, there's absolutely no information pointing towards AT&T ending or planning on ending this partnership anytime soon, if at all. After Project Hemisphere was widely exposed, there was a leaked document that showed exactly how sneaky AT&T was. And the contract between the government agency buying the data and AT&T goes as follows. The government agency agrees not to use the data as evidence in any judicial or administrative proceedings unless there is no other available and admissible probative evidence. The government agency shall make every effort to ensure the information provided by the contractor is non-attributable to AT&T if the data is provided to a third party. That is a direct quote and also just a small snippet of part of the contract between these government agencies and AT&T. And what it basically says is, you didn't buy this from us and you don't even know where this came from. They essentially wanted to separate the AT&T brand as much as possible from the data that they were selling to the government. And while Project Hemisphere is still technically officially secret, all information used in court filings, case reports, and other documents involving Project Hemisphere are cited as information obtained from an AT&T subpoena, which on paper made it look like the government forced AT&T to give up the data on this one specific situation, but in reality, they were paying for it all along. And AT&T was more than willing to not only give access to their data, but to sell everybody's data to any government agency that was willing to pay. Now, what exactly did the government want to use this data for? In 2013, after Project Hemisphere was officially exposed, different law enforcement agencies made it seem like they were only using this to specifically find people that were involved in high-level drug-related activities. But through some of the available information during the initial expose in 2013, it was proven that they were also looking into other non-drug related crimes, such as bomb threats, impersonating military generals, organized crime, and other crimes of the sort. But they were all crime related. Now the question remains, what do they even have access to? What data is AT&T collecting, storing, and selling? And the simple answer is everything, always, and forever. The longer answer is AT&T specifically collects and stores metadata related to every single call that happens on any part of their infrastructure. And this metadata includes the phone numbers that called each other, who these people are, the date of these phone calls, the length of these phone calls, when these phone calls took place, where these people were when they took place of these phone calls, text messages, voicemails, and anything else that AT&T has access to, they are collecting, storing, and selling to the US government. And I guess the final question is this even legal? And that's where we are today. As I mentioned, this project is still technically officially secret, although at this point, it's not a secret at all. And with this information being known and well exposed and relatively well discussed, there is significant legal and privacy concerns surrounding this entire operation. But nothing is formally being done. And I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know if this is legal or not. But even if it's not, it's going to take a lot of force to make anything change. In November of 2023, U.S. Senator Ronald Lee Wyden addressed the U.S. General Attorney Merrick Garland and called for the release of additional information regarding Project Hemisphere. And in this letter from this U.S. Senator, he expressed his massive concern for the legality of this operation that was currently ongoing and how they were able to conduct such extensive searches of domestic phone records without any need for a warrant. Which is true. Like I said, if you are using AT&T right now, any government agency that is currently paying for access to the database can access anything you've ever done on the AT&T ecosystem. Calls, texts, voicemails, anything. And as of the legality, people are definitely curious and concerned, but nothing's being done as of yet. So this conspiracy is still ongoing and developing, so maybe in a future episode I'll follow up. I think in this day and age, it's pretty well assumed that the government has access to any piece of information they could possibly ever want or need. And even if they don't have direct access to it, they could get it relatively quickly. And Project Hemisphere is just proof of that. And for some people, this may not seem shocking at all. Although in 2013, when this was first exposed, I'm sure this was a rather alarming revelation. And on top of that, to discover that this has been going on since 1987 is definitely enough to make you raise an eyebrow. Of course, you could say, why worry if you have nothing to hide? But at the same token, there is definitely a violation of privacy happening here. Like, if the government subpoenaed AT&T about a specific court case that is actively ongoing, that's one thing, and that's a different conversation. But any government agency or police unit being able to pay to have access to essentially everybody's phone records is an entirely different situation. If nothing else, it's interesting to think about. Because if you are an American taxpayer and also a customer of AT&T, you are essentially paying for the people who are spying on you to spy on you by providing them your information that you pay for. It's kind of like hiring a private investigator being like, hey, I'm going to pay you to follow me around, and also here's a tracking device that I'm just going to put in my pocket. Use it to track me at any time, and I'm going to pay for all of this. But with that being said, this is only the first entry on this list. So let's keep going. Operation Snow White. The Church of Scientology is likely the most famous cult in all of human history. They've got a massive headquarters in Los Angeles, not to mention their alleged 11,000 locations worldwide, a very wealthy, powerful, and influential member base, and likely one of the most controversial rises and existences in modern day religion. In modern times, the Church of Scientology is known for being that place that Tom Cruise goes to and for helping skateboard YouTubers ruin their career. But did you also know that in the 1970s, the Church of Scientology carried out the largest infiltration of the US government in all of American history? Well, they did. And they did it successfully. But let me give a bit of background. The Church of Scientology was founded in 1952 by L. Ron Hubbard, a man who had just published a successful book and then lost the rights to it after a bankruptcy. Obviously, if you're an author who just had a wildly successful book and then somehow fumbled it all, of course you don't write another book, you start a religion. And in 1957, Scientology was granted tax exemption by the IRS because the IRS had officially recognized Scientology as a church. But a decade later, in 1967, the IRS decided that that wasn't true anymore, and that the Church of Scientology wasn't actually a church. It was a lot of things, and primarily acted as a business, and for that reason, needed to pay taxes. And this made L. Ron very upset. Losing their tax-exempt status wasn't the only interaction that Scientology had with the government, but it was definitely the most alarming to L. Ron Hubbard. Around this time as well, the FBI was also periodically checking in on Scientology just to see what they were up to. And in 1963, they were even raided by the Food and Drug Administration. Now, obviously, if the government is telling you that what you're doing is not what a church is supposed to be doing, and that you're being investigated and literally raided by multiple different government agencies, obviously you're going to make the necessary changes to maintain your tax-exempt status and act more accordingly to how a religious nonprofit should act, right? Well, of course not. And Scientology's rebuttal to the government making them pay taxes again was Operation Snow White. In 1966, a year before Scientology officially lost their tax-exempt status, L. Ron Hubbard had officially organized the Guardian's Office, which was a subgroup within Scientology that was specifically meant to carry out Operation Snow White. Now, the natural next question is, what is Operation Snow White? And bluntly put, it was Scientology's effort to remove any negative documentation about Scientology within the US government. Any document, any file, any report, anything within the US government that mentioned anything about Scientology that was even remotely negative, keep in mind, not even false, just remotely negative, was a target of Operation Snow White. And the goal was to have these files, documents, or reports stolen, destroyed, or at at the very least, removed. And while this was happening officially in 1966, as early as 1960, L. Ron Hubbard was beginning to encourage members to take up jobs at the government, specifically as secretaries or bodyguards or janitors, any job that could get a member of Scientology within the United States government, obviously to exploit that power, but we'll get into that. Before Scientology was able to implant their own members into the United States government, they had to work with people that were already there, and that's where Michael Meisner and Gerald Wolfe come in. In 1973, both of these men worked for the IRS as typists, and they specifically worked in the Department of Religious Tax Exemption, a perfect connection for Scientology. These men were infiltrated by Scientology and began making illegal copies to provide to Scientology to provide them with more information and context about how the system worked. But this quickly led to forgery and literal breaking and entering within the United States government offices. This relationship had been going on for years, and the infiltration of the United States government by the Church of Scientology was growing. And because of this, L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology as a whole was getting concerned that their in at the government could potentially turn on them. And because of this, the Church of Scientology kidnapped Michael Meisner and kept him in captivity, where he was literally imprisoned by the Church of Scientology to ensure that he would not rat on the Church of Scientology and spill the beans about Operation Snow White. After 3 months of captivity, Meisner was able to escape the Church of Scientology, contact the FBI, turn himself in, and tell them everything. And this breakthrough was catastrophic for the Church of Scientology, as it led to the biggest FBI raid in all of United States history, with 156 FBI agents raiding the Los Angeles Scientology office. And during this raid, they found everything that they were looking for. Stolen documents, forged documents, fake passports, fake IDs, fake FBI IDs, fake security badges, lock-picking tools, wiretaps, plans, internal documents, basically everything they needed to prove not only the existence, but the step-by-step plan and execution of Operation Snow White. One of the most insane findings about this entire raid was the fact that at its peak, Operation Snow White had likely up to 5,000 undercover agents infiltrating the United States government in one way, shape, or form. They were in or had access to at least 136 organizations within the United States government, including the IRS, the DEA, the Coast Guard, and so on, and had installed wiretaps and stolen documents from essentially every person working within the United States government that had anything to do with Scientology or tax exemption. The sheer depth that Scientology was able to penetrate within the United States government is insane. And it wasn't just the United States government that they were able to penetrate. These 5,000 spies that they had were across the globe, working within the government agencies across the globe as well to maintain their tax-free status and, most importantly, their good name in numerous countries around the world. In 1979, when Operation Snow White was fully exposed and fully ended, L. Ron Hubbard's wife and 10 other Scientologists were sentenced to 5 years in prison, which to me seems light considering the complexity of the situation, but that's irrelevant. And L. Ron Hubbard himself was actually never formally charged and spent the rest of his life after Operation Snow White in hiding. Operation Snow White is definitely interesting, and I think the only operation I've touched on so far that involves a private organization conducting a covert operation on the government. But yeah, the Church of Scientology really didn't want to pay taxes. And they didn't want to pay taxes so much that they were willing to essentially infiltrate the United States government to make sure that that didn't happen. And for a long time, they did so successfully. And as crazy as that is, we still have more to cover. The Zimmerman telegram. There's no doubt that in modern times, the United States and Mexican border definitely have some tension. And the history of this tension goes back all the way into the 1800s, when Mexico lost a significant amount of land to the United States, specifically Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, which Mexico had lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. Following that war, Mexican and American tensions were understandably at an all-time high, and these tensions from the mid-1800s bled into the early 1900s. And it was during the early 1900s when an opportunistic Germany had an idea. In 1917, Arthur Zimmermann, the German foreign minister, sent a secret diplomatic message directly to the German ambassador in Mexico and the Mexican president. And this secret telegram was short, concise, and if left unfound, would have changed the course of history forever. And I'll explain what I mean by if left unfound. But the telegram went as follows. We make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis. We make war together, we make peace together. And the telegram included some more information, but this was the most significant sentence in the entire telegram. Previous to this telegram being sent, German officials had been spending time in Mexico, building a relationship and bonding with Mexico over their disdain and distrust for America. In Germany's eyes, this gave the two countries not only something in common, but also a common enemy. And even if Mexico didn't really trust or like Germany, Germany at least knew that Mexico didn't trust or like the United States, and they could use that. Hence, this proposal. The proposal specifically wanted Mexico to invade the United States. Obviously, Germany would be joining and supporting them in this invasion, and through this invasion, Germany promised Mexico that if they were successful, Germany would give Mexico all of their lost land back. Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico would all be Mexican land again if they were willing to help Germany invade United States soil. Now, Germany didn't necessarily want to just take over the United States, but they did want to distract them, because World War I was brewing in Europe, and the last thing that Germany wanted was America getting involved on European soil. They had enough to deal with. So they figured if Mexico could distract America, Germany could focus on Europe. However, there's a reason why this never happened, and it's not because Mexico didn't want to. Truthfully, we don't know whether they wanted to or not, because they never got the opportunity to execute on this plan. This specific telegram that was sent from Germany to Mexico was intercepted by British intelligence, as they had been monitoring all of Germany's communications for this specific reason. And at first, it was reported that the British government didn't exactly know what to do about this information, because although they wanted to inform the United States about this plan as soon as possible, they also didn't want to give up too early the fact that they were spying on the German communications, because that would obviously cut off their supply of communication and lessen their intelligence, which obviously was not strategic. And after only a few weeks of planning a methodical way of releasing this information without giving up their secrets, the cat was out of the bag. And in February of 1917, the United States public was made aware of the Zimmermann telegraph. This information changed the course of history, because during this time, the American people had largely supported neutrality within this war. But once it was abundantly clear that America was a direct target of Germany, the American people definitely saw the situation over in Europe much differently. And with growing public pressure from the telegram being leaked and Germany continuing to use unrestricted submarine warfare, the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, decided to declare war on Germany in April of 1917, officially getting the United States involved in World War I. So yeah, the Zimmermann telegram is a crazy story for multiple reasons. Firstly, because Germany just had such a devious plan to attack and distract the United States using Mexico as a proxy, and also the fact that one telegram being intercepted by British intelligence literally changed the course of history by preventing this attack and also getting the United States involved in World War I. And it's also a bit ironic too, because the entire reason for the Zimmermann telegram was to keep the United States out of World War I happening over in Europe. And because of this interception and this proposed attack directly on the United States, it backfired on Germany completely and got the United States directly involved in the war. To me, this is such an interesting piece of history, and it was something I knew nothing about in regards to World War I. And for that reason, I knew I had to add it to this list. But if you can believe it, we've still got more ground to cover. So let's keep moving. The US government helping Saddam Hussein. When you hear the name Saddam Hussein, the first thing you probably think is public enemy of the United States, not necessarily ally of the United States. However, both of those statements are technically true, depending on the time frame. During the 1990s and 2000s, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein was an enemy and a target of the United States government. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But did you know that before he became such this large public enemy, the US government was actually directly supporting Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq war from 1980 to 1988? To be very clear, they weren't necessarily on good terms, but it was definitely a situation of an enemy of my enemy is my friend. During the late 70s and early 80s, the US government viewed Saddam's regime as beneficial pushback to Iran's growing influence after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which literally overthrew the US-backed Shah and replaced him with an anti-American Islamic government. Once again, we're talking about another situation where a government is taking advantage of another country's political unease. Iran and Iraq were at war, and the US was definitely not happy with Iran because they had literally just had their US-backed government overthrown by an anti-American government, and for that reason, US was rather keen to help Iraq defeat Iran, even if they weren't necessarily friends. One of the biggest aids provided to Iraq by the United States government was satellite imagery. The United States had satellite imagery of Iran's military building up specific military bases that were near and likely to invade vulnerable or unprotected parts of Iraq. But the US government didn't only just provide Iraq with military intelligence and satellite images. They also provided weapons and materials that were used to develop chemical weapons. Chemical weapons that Saddam used against Iranian troops and even civilians. Now, a different conspiracy within this conspiracy was whether or not the American government knew that Iraq was using the materials provided by the United States government to create chemical weapons. That was until declassified documents revealed that the US government were well aware that Iraq was committing war crimes via the materials they were providing them, but decided that they were just going to ignore the war crimes because Saddam at this point was being a useful ally by attacking and fighting Iran. But everything began to change in 1990 after the Iran-Iraq war, because in 1990, Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait. fleet, which directly threatened the US, specifically through their oil interests that they had in the Persian Gulf at the time. This attack almost instantly made the US government shift its stance on Iraq and Saddam Hussein, and they began to label him a dictator who needed to be removed. And a year later, in 1991, Gulf War began. And in 2003, after a decade of sanctions, the US invaded Iraq and executed Saddam Hussein. And just goes to show that just because you and someone else have a common enemy doesn't necessarily mean that you guys are on the same page. And the same weapons that the US government provided to Iraq to fight Iran were also used to fight Kuwait, which directly negatively impacted the US government. And obviously, in this situation, the US was fine with war crimes as long as you're on their side. But if you're gonna mess up their oil connections, you're gonna have a serious problem. For some of my older viewers, this may or may not be news to you. However, for a majority of my younger following, or for people who didn't have the full story about this entire conflict, I thought that this tidbit about America helping Saddam Hussein was definitely an interesting piece of American history. And yet, we're still not done yet. Before we get to the last entry in this list, I just need to say, if you guys are enjoying the series about crazy conspiracy theories that turned out to be true, please leave a like or leave a comment letting me know that you want me to continue this series. Ironically, some of your guys' favorite videos are some of YouTube's least favorites, specifically the conspiracy and drug series. However, I will continue to make them as long as you guys continue to support and want them. My ultimate goal is to give you guys exactly what you want. And as long as I know that you guys want this content, I'll continue to make it for you. Your guys' support really means a lot, and I take your feedback seriously. But with that being said, let's get to the final entry on this list. Walt Disney working for the FBI. Walt Disney is one of the most famous people of all time, and there is a ton of conspiracies surrounding Walt Disney. And I think we've even discussed the whole him freezing his body thing in a different video. But this true conspiracy actually has nothing to do with that, and has everything to do with his involvement with the FBI, which to this day still is one of the more secret and ominous things about his personal life. When discussing the thoughts, opinions, or beliefs of Walt Disney, there's a lot to bring up, and a lot of assumption and skepticism. But one thing that was absolutely confirmed was Walt Disney's absolute disdain for communism and anything that was anti-capitalist. Coincidentally, during this time, the US government had the exact same thought, and this was prompted by the Red Scare, which was essentially the government's fear of communist ideals or beliefs or influence gaining popularity or taking place on American soil. And because Walt Disney and the United States government were both on the same page and both extremely powerful, in the 1950s, they decided to form a partnership. Walt Disney specifically acted as a confidential informant for the FBI, and his role was interesting to say the least. Now I have to make a distinction here because this video is conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. So I kind of have to separate fact versus, well, still conspiracy based off of information that are not yet proven yet. So let me quickly give you everything that is certifiably true right now. There is a declassified FBI document known simply as Walt Disney's name, Walter Elias Disney. And this document contains over 570 pages of information, including Walt Disney's connection to the FBI. However, most of this information is either redacted or still classified. What wasn't redacted and is currently confirmed is the following. Walt Disney granted the FBI to use the Walt Disney parks however they pleased for whatever reason they may want. And in the same agreement, the FBI offered Walt Disney to use FBI offices for whatever he may need. Not with the same unrestricted access, but there was access involved. One of the proposed uses was allowing Walt Disney to film the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse within the FBI offices, which to me seems strange because if you have Disneyland, you likely have the capability to film some sort of soundstage or film studio. But regardless, if you wanted to film within FBI offices, I suppose that's your right. In October of 1947, Walt Disney did testify in front of the House Un-American Activity Committee, a committee that specifically investigated communist happenings on American soil at the time. Obviously, about communistic concerns he had observed. I mention this because this is a documented fact and also gives more weight to what I'm about to discuss, which leads into the realm of uncertainty and possible conspiracy. So stepping out of the facts, it is claimed that from 1940 all the way up until 1966, at the year of his death, Walt Disney was directly involved with the FBI, which was confirmed that he was at least somewhat involved as an informant. But it is also believed that Walt Disney was specifically using his connection and authority within Hollywood to essentially report on individuals in Hollywood who were suspected of having either communist ties, beliefs, or had ideals that they were looking to influence or share with others, typically through media. In our last video too, we talked about how at this same time, during the second Red Scare, the US government was also publicly discrediting people that were outspoken about their communistic views, with the government aiming to discredit these people so people wouldn't believe them and start to also agree with communism. That operation was known as COINTELPRO, and I actually talked about it in my last video. So this one is kind of debatable because I'm talking about a lot of things that actually aren't proven true, but I think the this story is worth mentioning, and there is obviously truth that is currently publicly available, and I think it sparks an interesting conversation. At the very least, provably, Walt Disney was involved with the FBI, and depending on who you talk to, there's a whole slew of other thoughts of what else was going on there. But I think this story definitely holds a bit of weight considering the time where this took place and what the government was actively doing at this time with COINTELPRO. So, like I said, because this is a video about true conspiracies, let's just say that the conspiracy was that Walt Disney let the FBI use his parks. And in that case, that's a completely true conspiracy, and Walt Disney did give the FBI access to use the park however they saw fit, if they absolutely needed to. But everything else I did mention, as I'm clearly outlining once again, is still kind of up in the air. But I thought it was worth mentioning because it added a lot of interesting detail to the situation. Bigfoot files. Nope, you heard me right. There is a declassified document directly from the FBI regarding Bigfoot. And of course, it confirms the existence of Bigfoot, right? Not exactly. Oh, and keep in mind, this video only gets crazier as the video goes on. So if the first thing we're discussing is a declassified FBI document on Bigfoot, well, just wait and see what we end up talking about later in the video. But with that being said, the FBI didn't confirm the existence of Bigfoot, but they did have a very interesting situation surrounding a supposed Bigfoot fur sample. In the year 1976, a man named Peter Byron, the director of the Bigfoot Information Center and Exhibition in Oregon at the time, wrote a letter directly to the FBI asking if they'd be willing to test a sample of some alleged Bigfoot hair that they had. Peter isn't just some random guy. Not only was he the director of the Bigfoot Information Center, but he's also a zoologist. Well, a cryptozoologist, which, if you don't know what that means, it's basically just somebody who researches cryptids, and there's no actual backing behind the term. Regardless, those are his qualifications. And apparently, that was enough to get the FBI not only to respond, but to take his request seriously. The assistant director of the FBI's Scientific and Technical Services Division responded to Peter directly, and even told Peter that in the past, the FBI had actually examined other examples of physical evidence related to Bigfoot. So this wasn't necessarily uncommon for the FBI. The FBI had the results from the test, and they informed Peter that the hair sample that he had and claimed was from Bigfoot was actually, in all likelihood, from a deer. At that point, the case was filed and hidden away for decades. That was until 2019 when the FBI declassified this document and released all 22 pages inside of it, which includes all of the correspondence between the FBI and Peter, all of the lab results, and all of the internal memos associated with this entire claim. To me, the craziest part about this entire situation is the fact that the FBI took this request for DNA sampling on a alleged Bigfoot hair seriously, and the fact that they did this during the time that Ted Bundy was literally on the loose. Like, the FBI was looking for Ted Bundy, and they were like, well, I mean, Ted Bundy's on the loose, but we also might have Bigfoot hair, so the timing on that is crazy. And obviously, it's a big organization, but it's just a funny thought. But if nothing else, in 2019, when the FBI finally declassified the Bigfoot files, well, a lot of people were probably really excited until they actually read what the file contained. The Silver Master Spy Ring. The Silver Master Spy Ring, or internally known at the FBI as the Silver Master File, was a declassified document of the FBI that contained 162 volumes and over 26,000 total pages, which ultimately revealed that during the Cold War, there was a massive ring of spies in the US government that were, first of all, high-ranking, and second of all, secretly collecting and sending sensitive information directly to the Soviet Union. If you watched one of our last conspiracy theory videos, then you would have heard me talk about Operation Snow White, which in short was the operation conducted by Scientology to infiltrate the US government, which they were extremely successful at doing. But the Silver Master File takes place just before the Cold War and during most of the Cold War. This case goes back as early as 1945, when a defector of the Soviet Union came to the United States and worked in the United States government. But she wasn't the spy. She was actually the one who ratted on the spy. This woman's name was Elizabeth Bentley, and she used to work for the Soviet Union as a courier. And so she was aware of information coming into and leaving the Soviet Union. And during her time working as a courier for the Soviet Union, she realized that there was a lot of information coming from the States, specifically from a man named Nathan Gregory Silvermaster. And when Elizabeth Bentley defected from the Soviet Union and actually came to the United States, she was ready to spill the beans. But unfortunately, that was something that Nathan Gregory Silvermaster had been doing for a long time. Nathan was an economist for the United States War Production Board during World War II, meaning that he played an extremely important and sensitive role within the US government, especially in regards to foreign affairs. However, even though Nathan played such a strategic role within the United States government, he wasn't on the United States' side. Silvermaster really has an odd background too, because he was born in 1898 in Odessa, Russia, but then moved to China of all places. And what did he do in China? Obviously, he learned English. And he learned how to speak English perfectly with a British accent in China. He emigrated from China to the United States of America, where he went to university, got a PhD, and became an American citizen in 1926. Interestingly, during this time, Nathan was an outspoken communist. Even in university, the thesis he wrote was titled Lenin's Economic Thought Prior to the October Revolution, which alone isn't damning, but I mean, it's definitely a red flag. But I wasn't able to read this actual thesis, so I can't necessarily give my thoughts on what he mentioned because you could be on either side of this. But he was also, on top of both of these things, reported to be in contact with a very large number of Communist Party USA officials, and was even an active member of numerous communist front groups in the United States. However, with all of this being known, the US decided that this person would be great to hire on just before and during the Cold War, and it totally backfired. Like I mentioned, Silvermaster was a spy and was sending sensitive documents directly to the Soviet Union. He himself was specifically focusing on sending reports on US arms production, which was basically sensitive information reports on bombers, planes, tanks, guns, radar and submarines, and things like that. Basically, anything sensitive to do with American weaponry that Nathan could get his hands on, he was taking a picture of and sending to the Soviet Union. But as I mentioned, this was a spy ring. He didn't work alone, and he was coordinating with a dozen other Soviet operatives. And these people worked in the Army, in the Department of Agriculture, and in the Office of Strategic Services, which was the agency that came before the CIA. All 12 of these people were consistently sending sensitive documents to the Soviet Union, which on top of Nathan's leaks also included war strategy, nuclear weapons developments, and other forms of diplomatic communications. Basically anything that they could leak that would be of benefit to the Soviet Union, they were sending. And they could do so because they had so much access, as these were all high-ranking spies. Because of the tip that the FBI got from Elizabeth Bentley about Silvermaster being a potential spy, the government over the next 3 years paid extra attention to Silvermaster specifically and others in the FBI at the time. And after those 3 years and 26,000 pages later, the government had their 12 guys. But surprisingly, even though there was a huge data breach within the US government, almost nobody who was a part of the spy ring was actually ever prosecuted. Mainly because if the FBI wanted to prosecute these people, they would have had to expose a lot of secrets about data collection, and to them, it wasn't worth it, and it was more of a national security risk to prosecute them than to just kick them out of the US government. Operation Shocker. Operation Shocker was a secret FBI counterintelligence operation that took place from 1959 all the way through 1982. And its sole goal was to deceive the Soviet Union's military intelligence agency, specifically by feeding them fake information. I knew I obviously had to put Operation Shocker after the Silvermaster files because it just makes so much sense. Operation Shocker centers around one man, Joseph Edward Cassidy. He was a U.S. Army first sergeant, and his job was to pretend to defect from the United States of America to help aid the Soviets. And after getting full approval from the U.S. Army, he was officially able to work as a double agent. He of course had to start by building trust with the Soviet Union, which is exactly what he did, and he gave the Soviets real information that was very low risk, but it was enough to build trust. And once the relationship between Cassidy and the Soviet Union was established, that's when the shenanigans really began to start, as Cassidy would slowly feed the Soviet Union fake documents. But not just a few. Over the course of this operation, Cassidy fed the Soviets over 4,000 documents. One of the main focuses of a lot of these documents were about a fictional nerve agent that the United States government was developing. The point of this information on this fake nerve agent was to A, make the Russians paranoid, and B, make them spend time and money developing and researching a nerve agent that didn't exist. And while Operation Shocker very likely caused the Soviet Union to waste time, energy, and resources on developing an antidote and protection measures from this fictional nerve agent, and possibly causing them fear of what the United States may do with this nerve agent, this operation was definitely not fully beneficial for the United States. Firstly, because 2 FBI agents actually died in a plane crash while conducting surveillance for Operation Shocker, and because this operation was so secret, the families of the agents that died were told lies about the entire thing until this was later declassified. But besides the FBI agents that were killed, it's suspected that because the US government was feeding fake information about a nerve agent to the Soviet Union, this caused the Soviets to begin researching their own nerve agent. And because of that, the Soviets did develop a very real nerve agent, which was known as Novichok. Up until this time, the Operation Shocker documents were declassified. Nobody besides a few high-ranking agents in the FBI were even aware of the true full scope of Operation Shocker. But today, everybody knows the truth. And I'm really hoping that the families of the lost FBI agents know the truth as well. Because imagine if they didn't know and you're just laying on your bed watching a YouTube video and you know the truth and they still don't. Operation Shocker was truly a shocker. Operation Washtub. Operation Washtub, once again, was a Cold War era program launched by the United States government. And while this is going to be the last thing involving Russia I'm going to put on this list, it's too good not to mention, and this is actually probably the coolest out of the three. During the 1950s, the US Air Force and the FBI were both very concerned that if the Soviets were going to attack America, they were going to do so through Alaska. And because of this, the FBI took action by training Alaskan civilians in covert operations. The FBI selectively chose local fishermen, bush pilots, trappers, and basically any rootin' tootin' tough guy in Alaska they could find that were A, familiar with the landscape, and B, could survive off-grid in Alaska. Once they had collected these civilian men, they started to secretly train them, specifically on how to hide and transmit information, how to move undetected, and how to resist interrogation. Their goal wasn't necessarily to fight as soldiers or to be, ninjas. Their goal was to simply act as civilians, and if there was a Soviet occupation that took place within Alaska, they could be working as secret agents behind enemy lines. And the Soviets would be none the wiser. I can only imagine how cool it would be to be like a hunter in Alaska, and then you get approached by the FBI and they're like, hey, do you want us to train you how to be a spy for the US government? Obviously, the Soviets never had an occupation in Alaska, but that doesn't mean that the United States wasn't prepared for it. All of these men that were trained by the FBI had to keep all of this a secret from their family. And this entire operation was a secret until the early 2010s, when the Operation Washtub document was declassified, and the world got to know exactly how sneaky the Americans can be. And honestly, I think this is a pretty genius operation. Project TMB. Did you know that the FBI once planned on assassinating popular YouTuber Trust Me Bro? Wait, what is this? Wait, sorry, I'm just reading this document live right now. The FBI said that the only way that they would not eliminate Trusty Bro is if Trusty Bro hit 1 million subscribers in the year 2025, and that his subscribers considered checking him out on Twitter and Instagram, just in case anything happened to his YouTube channel. Guys, this is a crazy declassified document, and it's probably best we take it seriously. For the sake of me and the channel, if you like our content, consider subscribing. And I've never mentioned our other socials before, but I have a Twitter that's pretty inactive, but it's there, and I have an Instagram that we post pretty regularly on. So if you're a fan of the channel, check it out. Because as of right now, the FBI is not on our side. And trust me, your subscription and follow might just save my flat 2D butt. The FBI tracking Aretha Franklin. Honestly, the title of this one kind of says it all. The FBI was tracking the Queen of Soul, Aretha Franklin, not for a little bit, but for over 40 years, according to declassified documents. Aretha Franklin was a famous singer of soul music and had no known criminal record. But that didn't stop the FBI from having a 270-page document about Franklin, on top of tracking her movements, all of her affiliations, and even scrubbing the lyrics from all of her songs just to get any information they could find. Why were they doing this? Well, because Aretha Franklin was an African-American singer, and she was involved with civil rights activism, something that the FBI was closely monitoring. One of the biggest reasons why the FBI was tracking Aretha Franklin was because she was very close to Martin Luther King Jr. She would perform at rallies, speak during protests, and was seen as an influential civil rights leader outside of just being a famous musician, which is why the FBI wanted to keep an eye on her. Basically, just because she was famous, black, and was outspoken about civil rights. And the FBI claimed that their main concern was that these sort of lyrics and speeches and movements could cause political unrest, which is interesting to say the least. And if you watched our last video about conspiracy theories, then you would know that Aretha Franklin was not the only person that was monitored by the FBI. There was an entire FBI operation known as COINTELPRO, which was dedicated to monitoring, gathering information, and even publicly discrediting and shaming people associated with either civil rights movements or communist movements. And this included a lot of famous people, including Martin Luther King Jr., John Lennon, Elvis Presley, Jimi Hendrix, Frank Sinatra, and many, many more. The files that the FBI kept on Aretha Franklin never showed that she did anything wrong. And the only thing that it really proved was that the FBI was willing to waste money to make sure that famous, rich, influential black people weren't saying anything that they didn't like. Operation Ajax. Operation Ajax was an operation led by the CIA, not the FBI. But it's worth talking about, so I'm going to mention it here, and was also in collaboration with the British intelligence agency MI6, a group you've probably heard of. Operation Ajax revolves around Iran, oil, and overthrown governments, and you can probably already see where this is going. During the 1950s, a certain man was gaining a lot of popularity in Iran, a man named Mohammad Mosaddegh, and he became very popular and well-liked because he was able to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which essentially took the control of the oil production out of British hands, keeping the profit for the country of Iran, something that citizens would obviously appreciate. But who didn't appreciate it was the British government, because they had just lost money and power. And because of this, Iran was becoming more and more anti-Western and nationalistic in their sentiments, at least according to Britain. And when Britain tried to retaliate on their own, they failed. And because of that, they turned to the United States asking for help. And their claim to the United States was, hey, Mossadegh is getting a lot of power in Iran, and he's also pretty left-leaning. And this might invite the Soviets into the region and cause a lot more communism than we want to deal with. And basically, the British government could have stopped at left-leaning because the US government was already in. Keep in mind, this is the 1950s, this is post-World War II, approaching Cold War era, but it doesn't even really matter what time it is because America is anti-communist and they were ready to rumble. Once the United States government joined forces with the British government, Project Ajax was fully underway. The ultimate goal of this collaboration was to remove Mossadegh from power and install new management in the country of Iran that were more to the liking of the British and American governments. Part of what the British and American governments ended up doing was creating massive propaganda campaigns within Iran, bribing Iranian officials, infiltrating the press to spread messages that were more aligned with what the British and Americans wanted, and organizing intentionally violent riots in the street of Iran so that they could blame it on Mossadegh's incompetent government. And with all of these tactics and others put together, the goal of making Mossadegh seem unfit worked. And it set the stage for the return of the previous political system they had prior to Mossadegh, which was monarchical control. And once all of the covert operations from the US and British government worked, the Iranian military themselves actually backed the pro-Shah factions that were emerging in Iran and forced Mossadegh out of power. At this point, with the power vacuum in full effect, the US and the UK installed their own preferred monarch, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And this installed ruler ruled as the autocratic monarch for the next 26 years, and coincidentally, during his time in power, had rather substantial support from the West. That was until 1979 when the Islamic Revolution happened. When all of this was going on, there was a lot of people that were suspicious that this coup that the US government was essentially subsidizing and taking part in was happening. But of course, the US government and the British government denied it for many, many years. But decades later, the files surrounding Operation Ajax became declassified, and the CIA formally acknowledged its role in this coup that they had orchestrated in Iran in the 1950s. But by that point, the damage was already done. To me, one of the craziest things about this was that Mossadegh was actually democratically elected, meaning that the people wanted him in there, and he was in power at the will of the citizens of Iran. And as democratic as the US and British governments claim to be, they definitely don't appear to be fans of democracy when it doesn't directly benefit them, which is interesting. And it just makes you think, was there a Red Scare there, or were they just wanting to get their oil money back? I'll leave that up for you to decide. The CIA's insectocopter. In case insectocopter is a word you've never heard before, let me explain what it is. It's an insect helicopter, and it's something that the CIA developed during the Cold War as an experiment in spy technology, and was specifically one of the earliest attempts at biomimicry surveillance. Truthfully, this instrument is pretty cool and also pretty terrifying, because keep in mind, this is over 50 years ago when the CIA was able to create a pretty convincing looking dragonfly that had a miniature gas-powered engine equipped with an ultra lightweight microphone, meaning that it could fly on its own and just, record anything inconspicuously. And compared to alternatives that they were using at the time, this was completely unheard of and also revolutionary. Because now you don't need a huge drone that could be detected or a human in risky areas. You could literally just have a bug flying around. Nobody would be the wiser. However, even though the insectocopter looks extremely convincing, according to the CIA, they were never able to fully get it operational, and therefore it was never used. And this is because it was too affected by wind, the steering was too hard to control, and because of both of these factors, it was basically useless in any high pressure situation. And as a result, it was proof of concept and something they would likely put on the shelf. Keep in mind, this bug was created in the 1970s, and the declassification of it even existing didn't happen until 2003, when it was also placed in the CIA's museum for all to see, which is at least pretty cool. But it just makes you think, if over 50 years ago, the CIA was able to create a semi-operational, very lifelike looking dragonfly that was able to fly on its own and record, what do they have now? The declassified documents claimed it was never used, but is there another still classified document that claimed that they were able to make it work? Who knows? Or maybe the dragonfly didn't work, but the beetle worked. I don't know. It just makes you think. FBI memos of Hitler in Argentina. We all know that Hitler and Eva Braun both died in a bunker in Berlin in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. But not everybody believes that. Some people believe that Hitler survived the attack in Berlin and was able to make it to Argentina, where he lived out the rest of his life secretly. Now that is a conspiracy theory, and a pretty crazy one, but there is some interesting declassified files surrounding the situation. One notable file was a memo that was dated September 21st, 1945, which is only just a few months after the Second World War ended. This memo describes the documentation of an anonymous tip that the FBI received, claiming that Hitler had arrived in Argentina via a submarine and landed somewhere on the southern coast, and that the Argentinian government had prepared for his arrival and purposely sheltered him and other Nazi families in different areas across Argentina, basically putting them in dictator, genocidal, criminal protection. The memo specifically describes that Hitler was living in a heavily guarded area in the Andes with other high-ranking officers. And there are even reports claiming that Hitler shaved off his mustache, which, I mean, that's the least you could do if you're trying to be covert. Keep in mind, these are not facts. These are anonymous tips that the FBI just got, and they archived them and documented them, but didn't do much about them. And in the years following 1945, the FBI received more tips and letters of people saying similar things. But as a whole, they were just labeled as unsubstantiated and kept on record, but not necessarily acted on, as there was no real basis for the US government to do anything about them. And that's kind of where that FBI memo ends. And what I find really interesting is that the FBI got a lead about Bigfoot hair, and they took action and researched it, but they got a lead about Hitler potentially being alive, and they're like, nah. But I guess realistically, those are two different things, and it's one thing to set a hair for analysis, and it's another thing to try to look for a person in another country once you already know that they're dead. I guess that's kind of the distinction there. But what's interesting is that in 1955, 10 years later, the CIA actually sent agents to Argentina to confirm that Hitler wasn't in Argentina, because there was so many reports that they were getting from looking at the archived posts from the FBI in 1945, and also from more recent reports of people telling the CIA that they are confident that Hitler is alive and in South America. And while these declassified documents are definitely interesting, there is absolutely no proof or evidence that Hitler was ever in South America or didn't die in Berlin. And these declassified documents definitely gave the conspiracy theorists a great heyday when they were first declassified. But what do you think? To me, it's interesting that there is at least recorded documents of people claiming to see him in South America, but as far as proof, that's something we don't have. Operation Cauldron. The year is 1952, and the British government has just started a secret trial of biological weapons. This secret operation involved scientists from both the Royal Navy and Porton Down, and their job was to release biological agents onto caged monkeys and guinea pigs to see exactly what would happen. And the specific biological agents that these scientists were releasing onto these animals were the following: the pneumonic plague, the bubonic plague, brucellosis, and tularemia. The ultimate goal of these secret operations were to see what the actual effects would be on these animals to test their effectiveness in a warfare situation. But of course, it doesn't end there. This is only the beginning. And Britain isn't even the only government involved. Even though this entire operation is undertaken by Britain, these secret tests were actually a joint venture between the United States and Canada as well. And due to this collaboration, US documents actually later confirmed that this operation was not purely defensive in nature, like they tried to initially claim once they were exposed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, when doing testing with extremely infectious diseases, especially when you're doing it in secret, you have to make sure that you're doing this in a way that is extremely covert and safe to ensure that nobody sees it and the spread of this disease does not go outside your test subjects. And for that reason, the British government decided that the best way to execute Operation Cauldron was by literally taking a floating pontoon, putting it off the coast of the Isle of Lewis, filling it with 83 monkeys and 3,492 guinea pigs, dragging them into the middle of the water, and then, once this worst recreation of Noah's Ark ever was in the perfect position, the biological agents that I mentioned earlier were then dispensed onto all of these animals. The first way they infected these animals was by suspending a bomb, which then infected everybody, and the second method was by literally just spraying them as well. And I mean, if they already were able to spray them, then why did they need the bomb? Regardless, once the biological agents were dispersed over all of the test subjects, the animals aboard were then taken onto a boat and then dissected to see their cause of death. I just want to quickly point out how crazy it is that the British government is literally testing out a bubonic plague biological weapon in an open air environment, like they didn't learn anything from the 1300s. Now here's the thing, after this initial test, Operation Cauldron was initially considered to be successful. The British government felt proud that they had just discovered a brand new biological weapon, and they also had a brand new way of testing biological weapons. But this is where things take a massive turn for the worst. The conspiracy theory here isn't the fact that the British government killed an oddly specific amount of guinea pigs. What is what happened during the final series of tests of Operation Cauldron. During one of the very last tests of Operation Cauldron, a commercial fishing vessel accidentally drove directly through a cloud of plague bacteria on its way out of Britain to a fishing trip in the waters outside of Iceland. Now, to the British government's benefit, they did warn this fishing boat multiple times that there was an active military test going on, but the fishing boat ignored it and went right into the danger zone. Now, this is obviously a major concern. A commercial fishing vessel with 18 people on it has now just unknowingly traveled through a huge cloud of bubonic plague and other disease-filled gas. And the British government was extremely aware of this. So what did they do? Did they stop this fishing vessel for disinfection and medical examination to make sure that the fishermen were safe and that there was no spread of disease outside of these fishermen? Obviously not. The British government didn't tell this fishing vessel at all. Instead, what they decided to do was spy on this fishing vessel, turning these 18 crewmates into their brand new guinea pigs. For 21 days following the initial exposure, a British destroyer battleship was secretly observing the fishing vessel and also monitoring all of their radio communications, listening for any sort of medical distress calls. That alone is diabolical. But it gets worse, because during this time when this fishing vessel was being monitored, this fishing vessel was actually scheduled to stop at a port in England for a few days. And during this time, all of the crewmates would be getting off the boat and mingling with the general public. Now, obviously, this would be a huge health concern. So at this point, the British government finally intervened and told them what was going on, right? No. The British government allowed all of these 18 fishermen to mingle with the general public, further expanding their unconsensual human test subject pool. However, fortunately, nobody got sick. And because nobody got sick, and nobody outside a select handful of people involved in Operation Cauldron were aware of this, everybody involved swept Operation Cauldron under the rug, and for decades to come, Operation Cauldron was essentially not real. The government was successfully able to cover it up at the time, and most of the documents relevant to this case were actually burnt. And that is where the story would have ended. That was until rumors started floating around that eventually became a conspiracy theory. And by the time that these rumors and conspiracies were really starting to gain some traction, there was finally some investigation that was taking place. One of the first acknowledgments of this conspiracy was in 1979, literally 27 years after the experiment, when one of the MPs of the Western Isles, the area where this experiment took place, acknowledged this conspiracy and even questioned the defense secretary about them in Parliament. However, the defense secretary literally just said, quote, "They did not impinge in any way on the general public," and the case at that point was essentially closed. That was until 6 years later in 1985, when a whistleblower named Clive Ponting came across one of the files surrounding Operation Cauldron that had not been destroyed. And with Clive wanting the public to be aware about this crazy experiment, Clive anonymously told the Observer newspaper about it, which led to the Observer writing an article headlined, "British Germ Bomb Sprays Trawler." But even with this crazy story being exposed and making headlines, it was still not confirmed or acknowledged by the British government. 9 years later, in 1994, it was once again brought to Parliament, but shut down for being unsubstantiated. But then, finally, on January 21st, 2008, the Information Commissioner's Office ruled against the Ministry of Defense, forcing them to release everything they had about Operation Cauldron. And the biggest smoking gun that still existed was a 47-minute long video that showed the exact pontoon that was used and footage of exactly what happened on that pontoon. This 47-minute long video literally exposed everything, and at that point, it was confirmed 56 years later that this crazy conspiracy theory was actually the truth. The business plot. The year is 1933. Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR, has just been elected as the 32nd president of the United States. However, some people are not happy about this election, specifically some of the most wealthy and powerful businessmen in America. Why were these wealthy businessmen upset about FDR becoming president? Well, that's because FDR had a major plan to implement social programs within the United States, along with other progressive policies, and most notably, a shift away from the gold standard. Now, with all of these new political changes about to be implemented under FDR, what do you think that these powerful businessmen did in retaliation? Do you think they maybe donated more money to the other party next time the election rolled around? Or do you think that they tried to organize a coup to overthrow FDR to have a fascist regime installed within the United States of America? Well, if you're watching this video, you know it's the last one. But let me explain. Smedley Butler is a retired military corps major general. And in 1933, he was retired and highly decorated, and also a very outspoken anti-war activist. Smedley Butler was generally respected, but was specifically adored by by the veteran population within the United States, a population that was relatively large after World War I. And because all of the most wealthy and powerful businessmen were upset that FDR was about to fundamentally shift the country, at least in the eyes of these men, they decided that their best course of action was to orchestrate a coup and to have Smedley Butler be at the forefront of it. And the reason why they wanted Smedley specifically was because he was respected by veterans. And for that reason, if they could get Smedley on their side to spread their message, then these veterans would feel inspired to follow their ideology and they could use that manpower to overthrow the government. That was the idea, at least. The first point of contact between these wealthy businessmen and Butler was when Gerald C. McGuire approached Butler and simply probed him about his stance on FDR to kind of get a temperature check on Butler. And Butler, assuming something was going on, kind of played along and acted like he wasn't on FDR's side when he actually was. And it was at that moment when Butler was aware that some of the most powerful businessmen were all on the same page about financing a private army, bringing all of this manpower armed directly to the White House, and then giving FDR a list of commands to submit to, and the business plot, aka the fascist regime, would be then installed. The crazy thing is, all they asked of Butler was to give a speech. This coup already had a plan on exactly how they would organize, finance, and manage this small army and overthrowing of the government. The only thing that they wanted Butler for was to give a pre-written speech at the American Legion Convention, with the hopes that the speech would resonate with these military veterans, causing them to join this coup, allowing these businessmen to follow through with their plan. And as a reward, these people would make Butler the fascist dictator of this new American regime. Now, fortunately, this was something that Butler had absolutely no interest in. And although he declined requests to give speeches on numerous occasions and also made it clear that he was anti-war and also anti-banker, these individuals were so stubborn and so certain that Butler was the man to help their dreams come true that they were very persistent. So persistent, in fact, that in 1934, only 1 year later, Butler testified under oath before the United States House of Representatives Special Committee on Un-American Activities, specifically about the revelations he had about this entire plot. But this is where things get a bit murky, because the initial conspiracy theory of was there American businessmen having secret conversations and planning a coup to overthrow FDR to reinstate the gold standard a real thing? Yes. And unless you believe that Butler was lying under oath, then that plot was absolutely confirmed to be true during Butler's testimony. But where things get murky and I guess unconfirmed was the exact length that this plan was actually going to go through. Because when this entire situation was initially exposed, a lot of powerful people, specifically the governor of New York and other politicians, tried to laugh it off as, oh, well, Butler is over-exaggerating this. This wasn't actually going to happen. These were just rich guys that were upset and they were just chatting ideas, but this wasn't real. And this sentiment by some is also confirmed by the ultimate decision of the Congressional Committee. One, because nobody was ever prosecuted when this was brought to light. And also, the Congressional Committee final report said, quote, "There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have even been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient." But that's the issue. Might have been placed into execution. That plausible deniability gave these extremely powerful men an out to not be prosecuted, to not be further questioned, and also to allow them to have the story of, oh, no, that wasn't real, that was just an idea, when the plan ultimately failed and was exposed to the general public. Big Tobacco lied to you. In today's day and age, we know that smoking cigarettes has numerous side effects. We know that tobacco is bad for you. We know that inhaling carcinogens is not good for your lungs. And we know that nicotine is extremely addictive. Unfortunately, this is all now common knowledge and adults can make their decision on what they want to do. But prior to the 1990s, major tobacco companies had the general public in a chokehold, nearly convincing the world that smoking cigarettes was not only a good thing to do, but potentially even healthy for some situations. Now, the real paradigm shift around cigarettes happened in the 1990s, when whistleblowers were exposing the tobacco companies for all of the nefarious activities they were doing. However, that wasn't the first or only time that science proving cigarettes were bad for you actually came out. In the early 1950s, there were multiple scientific studies proving a link between cigarettes and cancer. And it was with the publishing of these studies that the American tobacco industry ramped up their marketing to the absolute next level to ensure their chokehold on the American public and to ultimately assert their dominance and maintain their fortune. But even before these studies came out, the marketing was still heavy. Like, for example, take the 1920s. During the 1920s, it was frowned upon for women to smoke. So for that reason, these tobacco companies took it upon themselves to shift the American mindset on women smoking so that these tobacco companies had 50% more consumers. And how they did this was crazy. Essentially, what these tobacco companies did was not only pay influential women to smoke in public settings and to be photographed and filmed smoking in public settings, but they even hijacked the women's rights movement from the 1920s to make their cigarettes seem like a way of fighting the patriarchy. And with the rise of feminism and empowering women, tobacco companies realized that if they could get their cigarettes involved in the movement, they would make a lot of money. And what they ultimately ended up doing was positioning cigarettes as a way to fight against the patriarchy, and they even eventually, in some ad campaigns, called cigarettes freedom sticks, empowering women to fight social norms by smoking cigarettes and being just like the men. That's the crazy level of manipulation we're talking about. But that's truly only the beginning. But I wanted to highlight that example because it's just insane. Another example of tobacco companies hijacking a movement was during World War II. In the early 1940s, smoking in public was actually banned in Nazi Germany because it was known that smoking was not good for you. So, tobacco companies in America made smoking seem like they were anti-Nazi activities and patriotic in nature. Once again, hijacking a movement and profit that they knew would ultimately lead to deaths. But on top of hijacking women's rights movements or wartime movements, the tobacco industry was not a stranger to creative advertising. And the tobacco company Camel had some extremely notable advertisements specifically featuring doctors and dentists that literally said something along the lines of, "Most doctors smoke Camels," which is literally an endorsement from doctors to smoke cigarettes. And these ads ran for decades. And with that association of doctors and surgeons with cigarettes, obviously they have to be healthy, right? Oh, and let's not even forget the literal Flintstones cigarette ads, obviously aimed at targeting children to get interested in cigarettes as well. At this point, I know I'm not saying necessarily anything new, but I really want to emphasize this point that during this time, prior to all of the anti-tobacco messaging that most of us grew up with, or at least experienced and saw the shift in our lifetime, the perception of cigarettes was completely different in past times. And I'm really trying to emphasize that point, that how strong the marketing and propaganda was in the name of tobacco. Which leads us to the conspiracy theory at play. It was claimed that all throughout the early 1900s, from basically 1900 to the 1990s, Big Tobacco had no idea that there was any negative side effects of tobacco. They were claiming that through all of the research that they did, there was health benefits and negligible side effects to tobacco, and for that reason, they were doing nothing wrong in their marketing or advertising, and their product was completely fine. Now, obviously today, we know that's not true at all. Although, at the time, the conversation was still ongoing, and it was up for people to decide whether they wanted to believe reports that were not typically marketed, or the marketing that was shoved down their throats on a daily basis. In 1964, when another major report came out, once again directly linking lung cancer and cigarettes, did these tobacco industries do anything to change their blend? Did they potentially stop selling their products? Did they recognize what they were doing was hurting people? Of course not. What they decided to do was double down, and not only buy their own studies and buy their own doctors, but they decided to go on marketing campaigns that specifically planted seeds of doubt in the consumer's mind to essentially try to nullify any genuine articles coming out against cigarettes. And I'll tell you what, these tobacco companies had much more of a marketing budget than any independent researcher could ever dream of. And it was for that reason that Big Tobacco was able to have this reign for so long. So even though real articles were coming out proving that cigarettes were detrimental to your health, for every one study that was coming out, the tobacco industry was paying for hundreds, flooding the market with conflicting information, allowing people to never come to a real conclusion. And on top of that, the tobacco industry was also actively trying to discredit any doctor who was personally speaking out against tobacco to once again lower their credibility. In the eyes of the general public, if you listened to Big Tobacco's propaganda and took it at face value, it would seem like they're doing everything right. As studies were coming out, they made sure to do their own independent studies to try to confirm or dispute those claims. And they were also actively trying to make as many improvements as possible to cigarettes, specifically adding filters and whatnot. And on top of this, Big Tobacco even created its own health committee to investigate tobacco even further, to ensure that the product that they were selling was 100% healthy. But these smoke and mirrors, no pun intended, could not go on for long. In 1996, Jeff Wiggins became one of the most famous whistleblowers in American history, when he provably exposed the tobacco industry for not only manipulating nicotine levels in tobacco to increase its addictiveness, as well as adding other chemicals such as ammonia, but also for intentionally falsifying reports and also hiding reports that proved cigarettes were dangerous for many decades. I'll be honest, at first I was kind of hesitant to add this into this video because I know that people are so aware now of how bad cigarettes are and how manipulative the cigarette industry can be. But I wanted to reiterate some key examples and also make the point extremely clear that there was once a time when people believed the propaganda from cigarette companies. And there was multiple decades where the cigarette companies had the American public and the world in a chokehold, specifically because of their targeted propaganda. And it has taken many decades, banning of advertisements, multiple whistleblowers, numerous studies proving the link between tobacco and cancer, just to try to make a dent in the massive narrative that the tobacco company built for the last near century. But yeah, it literally changed how Americans perceived marketing and corporations forever. And for that reason, I thought it was worth keeping in this video. But let's move on. The Oak Ridge experiments. At this point, everybody and their grandmother knows about Project MKUltra, and we've even talked about it in this exact series. But did you know that Canada had its own secret MKUltra project and is still currently being investigated by the Canadian government? That's right, it is called the Oak Ridge Experiment. Oak Ridge, for years, was the only forensic hospital in Ontario for people that were deemed criminally insane. And for that reason, Oak Ridge was the place that people were sent to who truly needed a psychiatric recalibration. And it was believed that the new experiments that were going on within the Oak Ridge walls were beneficial. The Oak Ridge experiments start with a doctor named Elliot T. Barker, who was a newly graduated psychiatrist out of the University of Toronto. And ever since graduating school, he was inspired by Dr. Maxwell Jones, who developed the concept of therapeutic community as a treatment for mental illness. And essentially what therapeutic community was having the mentally ill patient take an active part in their own treatment. But not only that, play an active role in the treatment of others as well, basically creating some sort of group healing. Now, that on the surface may not seem evil per se. It's interesting, especially for the 1950s. It's at least something to potentially consider, but what stemmed out of this initial inclination turned into something truly evil. After graduating, but before arriving at Oak Ridge, Baker traveled around the world visiting interesting places, notably Chinese prison camps, to see how they controlled people with behaviors. When Barker finally arrived in Oak Ridge in 1965, he had his perfect plan in mind. And his grand idea was to combine truth serums, sensory deprivation, and patient-led encounter groups to force psychopaths to confront their mental illness. Already off to a rough start, and I'm sure you can kind of already see the MKUltra comparisons. But trust me, we're only getting started. One of the first major issues with Oak Ridge was the fact that they were completely understaffed, which was one of the big incentives for hiring patients as therapists. They were basically having the prisoner patients that were already at Oak Ridge to now act as the caretaker or therapist for other patients. Essentially, the blind leading the blind. But it wasn't just talk therapy that these prisoner patients were having with each other. At Oak Ridge, you could order a drug treatment for another patient just because you wanted to see what would happen. And that includes ordering somebody else LSD, methamphetamine, or even some of their truth serums. And they even offered alcohol therapy. Interestingly, they knew that the alcohol wasn't going to cure mental illness, but what they figured would happen was that the alcohol would lower the mental defenses of these patients, forcing them to examine their own shortcomings, ideally allowing them to become aware of their mental illness, and then at that point becoming cured. That was the mindset, at least at the time. And while it's an interesting hypothesis at best, this was taken as truth and implemented in the worst way possible. The experiments that took place under Barker at Oak Ridge became more and more depraved and more unconsensual, and typically included patients with numerous experimental drug treatments multiple times a day, essentially keeping the inmates drugged out of their mind to the point of psychosis. One of the men that was held at Oak Ridge said the following, quote, "They gave you 6 shots a day of that stuff. By the end of the day, you didn't know who you were or what you were doing. You can't do that to people over and over and call it treatment, because that's just a nice word that people want to hear. The real word is torture, because that's all it was, beginning to end." And the experience that one man had within Oak Ridge was not uncommon. That was essentially the norm. But on top of just injecting drugs into prisoner patients, they also took it a step further. Barker, shortly after, invented something known as the Total Encounter Capsule. And essentially what it was a windowless room with padded walls, no furniture, and only an open toilet. There was no lights, there was one hole for food, and that was it. Prisoners would be sent in this room naked and would be in there alone in the dark for as long as 10 days at a time. Now, similar to MKUltra, the point of these experiments were to try to break the mind of the individual. Although with MKUltra, the goal was mind control. And with the Oak Ridge experiments, the goal, at least allegedly, was to help solve mental illness through what ended up just being torture. What's really interesting was that the Oak Ridge experiments at the time weren't necessarily even a secret. People weren't just extremely privy to it. And for those who were in the know, specifically in the psychiatric community, Elliot Baker seemed like somebody who was doing innovative work, and his experiments were considered avant-garde, interesting. And because at the time so little was known about mental health, this was seen as a great opportunity to learn. And people even believed that these treatments could potentially be beneficial, which obviously was not the case at all. But it still continues to get worse. Another major issue that was happening at Oak Ridge was because it was gaining popularity through the experimental treatments that were happening in it, the government was becoming more and more open to sending lesser criminals there. And it even got to the point where mischievous teenagers that were getting caught up in trouble were given the option to either serve prison time or go to Oak Ridge. And if you don't know what's going on behind Oak Ridge, anything sounds better than prison. And keep in mind, these people weren't murderers. These were like kids that were doing drugs and stealing cars. Not good, but there's a difference. But here's the thing. These teenagers that ended up getting sent to Oak Ridge had the same experience as these other criminals, coupled with the fact that not only were they tortured all day themselves, but they were also surrounded by extremely mentally ill people that were also tortured. And it goes without saying that the environment was extremely hostile, specifically because staff was low and security was almost non-existent. Patients had to fend for themselves, and in some cases, they were literally literally taking care of each other, although I use the term taking care of lightly, because they were responsible for each other, but nothing beneficial was happening. And unfortunately, some extremely depraved things were happening. But in case that isn't bad enough, in 1976, another forensic unit was opened, this time for women. I guess I forgot to mention it, but Oak Ridge was only for men, so they opened another location specifically for women. The location opened with 30 extremely mentally ill women, and unfortunately, these women were subject to the same conditions as Oak Ridge, but there was something worse happening. Because while at Oak Ridge, inmates were taking care of each other, in this new all-female facility, they decided that it would be smart to take some of the men from Oak Ridge to bring them to this new female facility, giving these men the role of therapist. That's right, some of the most dangerous men in Canada, a lot of which who were in Oak Ridge for sexual-related crimes, who have been tortured for the last few years, are now going to be sent to an all-women's facility with low security to act as some sort of authoritative figure. I'm sure you can only imagine what happened, and unfortunately, it was probably even sadder than you could possibly imagine. So yeah, we all know about MKUltra, but in the 1960s and 70s in Canada, the exact same things were going on. To me, this reminds me a lot of the whole lobotomy thing. It got very popular and was interesting for a while, but ended up just being something that was not cool whatsoever. There's actually an interview from 1993 where Elliot Barker goes on record on camera defending his work at Oak Ridge, saying that, quote, it was the reasonable thing to do at the time. And he also now resents the fact that he has to try to defend himself or his work. And that's because even in the 1990s, when people were becoming more and more privy to what was happening, they saw exactly how hellish the conditions truly were. The Oak Ridge experiments went on for over 15 years. And the ultimate result was absolutely no psychiatric development. Today, the Ontario Superior Court judge has officially condemned the experiments at Oak Ridge as flagrant and outrageous. But even still, with hindsight being 2020, how does a psychiatrist who's going to Chinese labor camps to investigate behavior control and putting convicted rapists into a female mental asylum as therapists seem like a good idea in any world to anybody? That's what I'm asking. And like I said, I know hindsight's 2020, but who thought these were good ideas? Not to mention all of the forced drugging and sensory deprivation of these psychiatric patients and prisoners. On June 25th, 2020, a civil lawsuit brought by 28 former patients of Oak Ridge sought justice from Barker and his partner for subjecting them and every other patient of Oak Ridge to unethical and degrading human experimentation from 1966 to 1983. And in August of 2022, a unanimous 3-judge panel sided with the victims of Oak Ridge and awarded general and punitive damages to the victims in the range of $1,000 to $2.7 million for the 28 patients. This decision not only brings some semblance of justice to the victims of Oak Ridge, but it is also a massive win for transparency, accountability, and ultimately the greater mental health movement. Although it is unfortunate that justice was served so many years later and that any of this even happened in the first place. Every person currently on the FBI's most wanted list. Chances are you've heard about the FBI's most wanted list at some point in your life. It's also likely that you don't know much about it besides the fact that it's a list of criminals. Well, I was in the same boat, so I did some research. And today I'm going to explain a brief history about the FBI's most wanted list and then take a deep dive into every single person who's on the list and why they're there. Spoiler alert, these are some bad people. The most wanted list was actually born in 1949 when the director of the FBI was at dinner with the chief and editor of the International News Service as they were discussing ways to promote and capture the FBI's toughest guys. The FBI wanted to use the newspaper to spread awareness to civilians to get more tips to help arm law enforcement with information. Shortly after this meeting, the list was published, and that very same day, one of the members that was on the initial list was caught. And from that point on, the FBI's most wanted list has been a staple when it comes to high-level justice. To be eligible to even be put on the FBI's most wanted list, you have to do some terrible things. And in most cases, you have to have a long history or a string of multiple things under your belt. Some examples of which we're gonna get into today. Oh, and the only ways to be removed from this list are being captured or dying. So take your pick. Alejandro Castillo. It's crazy that the first entry on this list is the youngest entry by far. Alejandro was only born in 1998 on November 26th, making him only 26 years old at the time of this recording. He was born in Arizona and is currently 5'6" and weighs anywhere from 180 to 190 pounds. He is male and Hispanic, and what landed him on this list may shock you. When Alejandro was only 17 years old, he was working at a Shomar's restaurant in Charlotte, North Carolina. He worked at this restaurant with his girlfriend. But not only his girlfriend, his ex-girlfriend also worked there as well. Alejandro's ex-girlfriend, Sandy, lent him some money, but unfortunately, she went missing before he could pay her back. But even stranger is the day after that Sandy, his ex-girlfriend, went missing, both Alejandro and his current girlfriend went missing as well. But although they all went missing, Alejandro and his girlfriend were no victims. They simply were on the run. What happened was the night before his ex-girlfriend Sandy went missing, Alejandro and Sandy had plans of meeting up so Alejandro could repay his debt, although that was never his intention. When the two met up, Alejandro and his girlfriend forced Sandy to get in the vehicle, and it was at that point when Alejandro's girlfriend held a gun to Sandy and they drove to the nearest ATM where she withdrew money. After this, they drove deep into the woods and Alejandro murdered his ex-girlfriend and left her body in a ditch. Alejandro's car was found abandoned a little bit outside of town, likely dumped by the murderers. But oddly enough, Sandy's car was found all the way in Arizona, basically on the opposite side of the country, where it was also abandoned. It was this discovery that allowed them to find surveillance footage of Alejandro and his girlfriend crossing the border into Mexico, where they currently reside. At least Alejandro still does. 3 months after they disappeared into Mexico, Alejandro's girlfriend actually turned herself in. Alejandro's girlfriend claims that one morning she woke up and Alejandro was simply gone, and with nothing else to do, she decided to turn herself in. And whether he simply abandoned her or she's telling a lie to cover his tracks, we may never know. But Alejandro, the 17-year-old murderer who's now 26, is still at large. Donald Eugene Fields II. Donald definitely looks like somebody who would be on this list. He was born on July 9th in 1964, is anywhere from 6 to 6 feet 4 tall. He's a white male and has a scar on his chest and a few tattoos as well. Fields is on this list for an extremely unsavory reason. He's alleged to have trafficked at least one child in Missouri from approximately 2013 to 2017. It is believed that Donald was knowingly attempting to recruit, entice, harbor, transport, provide, maintain, and solicit a person who he believed to be under the age of 18 years old. To put it in regular speak, he was essentially trying to sell a child for sex. His last known location is Franklin County, Missouri, but he's been reported to have been traveling around the country since 2022. Fortunately, one of the people that Fields was selling this underage person to was caught and sentenced to over 30 years in prison, and he even admitted to giving cash, a car, a motorcycle, Christmas presents, and vacations in exchange for access to this 14-year-old that Fields was soliciting. Every time the FBI gets a tip about him, they are putting up billboards, signs, and Facebook ads in the city to get any information. But unfortunately, it seems that Fields is typically one step ahead, although I hope he is brought to justice very soon. Vitel Homme Innocent. Ironically, Vitel's last name literally translates to innocent man in French, but this man is far from innocent. Vitel is one of the leaders of Haiti's largest and most violent gangs. Besides his affiliation with a gang that has been terrorizing Haiti for years, Vitel is also personally connected to a string of murders and kidnappings. In 2021, Vitel and his gang collaborated with another gang to kidnap 17 Christian missionaries that were currently in Haiti. And if this sounds familiar, you've probably heard of this story before when it was happening because it was pretty high profile. Disturbingly, out of all of these hostages, 5 of them were children, one of them being under 1 year old. But fortunately, they were all safely returned after this surely traumatic experience, after somebody paid an undisclosed amount of money. Initially, these gangs wanted $1 million per person, but who knows what they settled for. After this ransom was paid, Vitel's gang used this money to fund buying weapons, and later that year, the Haitian president was murdered, leaving a massive power vacuum and an opportunity for Vitel's gang to gain massive power in Haiti. In 2023, it's reported that this gang has up to 600 members, including children who are fighting against their will. Interestingly, Vitel offers a strange perspective into the life of crime in Haiti, whereas last year he actually did a full documentary with reporters where he showed off his lifestyle and even spoke to reporters about how he came to power and what his lifestyle is currently like. It goes without saying that Vitel is considered armed and extremely dangerous. For Vitel, the FBI is offering $2 million for anybody who can offer information leading to his arrest. But I think based on the brief that I gave about Vitel, it's understandable why this price is so high. And I also think it's no wonder how he's still on the loose today. Wilver Villegas Palomino. Wilver is a high-ranking member of the National Liberation Army, or ELN for short, which is a military movement which is active primarily in Colombia and Venezuela. ELN, similar to Craze Barry, the gang owned by Vitel, deals primarily with organized crime, specifically kidnapping, extortion, and even attacking oil infrastructure, basically eco-terrorism. And shortly after, in true Colombian fashion, got involved in the drug trade. Wilver personally is alleged to have killed multiple human rights activists in Colombia, as well as committing narco-terrorism, distribution of drugs, murder, and other similar charges. Wilver and his gang of ELN is heavily attributed to the massive influx of drugs into the southern states in the USA. And for that reason, the FBI is offering up to $5 million for any information that can help bring him to justice. Currently, there is absolutely no information available about where Wilver may reside. Although, if you have any clue, you might be $5 million richer. Ruja Ignatova. Although this person is definitely not a good person, compared to some of the other people on this list, Ruja is gonna seem like a petty thief. Ruja is a Bulgarian woman, and she was an entrepreneur, or so she was believed to be. Ruja was the founder of OneCoin Limited, which was a Bulgaria-based company that was marketing and purporting cryptocurrency. I'm sure as soon as it said cryptocurrency, you saw where this was going. OneCoin was defrauding billions of dollars from their investors all over the world. And in order to make her scheme as big as it was and go on as long as it was, Ruja was allegedly making false statements and representations to individuals in order to solicit more investments in OneCoin. Basically, more or less of your run-of-the-mill Ponzi scheme, and very similar to what happened recently with FTX, which was another huge cryptocurrency scandal. Throughout the entirety of its scheme, OneCoin is believed to have defrauded over $4 billion out of investors, which is insane. Ruja's company was officially charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, and securities fraud. And currently, Ruja is on the run. On October 12, 2017, Ruja was charged in the United States District Court, and today they were offering up to $5 million for any information that leads to her arrest or conviction. Note to self, do not buy into cryptocurrency pyramid schemes. I'm not anti-crypto, but I'm definitely anti-scam, and OneCoin was a huge scam. Arnaldo Jimenez. This man is absolutely vile, as is everybody on this list, but the specific details of this story just made me feel gross. On May 11th, 2012, Arnaldo got married to his wife, and only one day later, on May 12th, Arnaldo is alleged with murdering his wife by stabbing her to death in the back of his Maserati. He's alleged to, at that point, taken her dead body from his vehicle and putting her in the bathtub of her apartment, where he left her and then seemingly vanished. When Arnaldo's wife was not replying to any of her family's calls or texts and didn't pick up her children from school, her family called the police, where they did a wellness check and found her body in her tub, still in her wedding dress. Arnaldo is believed to be somewhere in Mexico, but unfortunately, after 12 years and hundreds of tips, nothing has brought the FBI any closer to bringing this man to justice. After the murder, phone records were able to trace Arnaldo across multiple states across the country and even ended with him in Texas, extremely close to the Mexican border. But unfortunately, that's where the records ended, and once he entered Mexico, there has been absolutely no sightings of him. Hopefully, Arnaldo was caught and serves life in prison for the crimes he's committed. But from what we've seen so far on this list, it seems that going to Mexico is a pretty good way to avoid jail time. Omar Alexander Cardenas. Omar's case is short and simple, but no less disturbing, as he is charged with murdering a man in broad daylight, with footage of him walking to and waddling away from the place where he committed this murder. Omar is another young entry on this list, being only 29 years old at the time of recording this video, and even younger when this crime happened. And while his crime is essentially caught on camera, not much is known about him, besides the fact that he's 5'7" and 300 pounds, which is a crazy build. On August 15th, 2019, Omar walked to an open-air shopping center where he stood in front of a barbershop, pulled a pistol out of his pants, and shot at the head of one of the people in the barbershop, who he instantly killed and then seemingly just casually walked away. With how brazen this murder was and the fact that it was in public, in broad daylight, and even caught on camera, to me it's honestly crazy that this man is still walking free today. Being a most wanted criminal has allowed the FBI to get a lot more tips and information about this individual, but unfortunately nothing has been able to help them find him. Likely because, like others on this list, he too fled the country to avoid prosecution. Yulan Adonai Archaga Carrales. MS-13 is one of the most violent criminal organizations in the world, active primarily in South America, specifically Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, but currently are active in Mexico and the United States as well. Yulan here is the alleged leader of the MS-13 in all of Honduras, making him responsible for a lot of shenanigans, to say the least, such as drug trafficking, human trafficking, extortion, kidnapping, and extreme acts of violence. Yulan specifically is wanted in the US for trafficking multi-ton loads of cocaine into the United States, as well as murder and a laundry list of others. Crazily, Yulan was actually apprehended and charged in court for the murder of 2 Honduras prosecutors, when during his trial, 20 armed men dressed in the same uniforms as the anti-gang unit walk into the court hearing and seconds after unload on the entire room. 4 police officers were killed, and Yulan was once again a free man. The power that these criminal organizations have in South America is honestly scary and strongly rivals the government, although some would argue that the two are intertwined. Although this man is only 5'5" and 160 pounds, he's one of the most powerful and deadly men in Honduras and likely in all of South America. And it's not necessarily shocking that the FBI is willing to offer up to $5 million for information leading to the conviction or arrest of Yulan. Alexis Flores. Alexis is another man from Honduras, although he is even shorter and smaller than the previous entry. He stands at a staggering 5'4" tall and weighs only 130 pounds. But his alleged crime is absolutely sickening. To put it bluntly, Alexis Flores is alleged to have kidnapped and strangled to death a 5-year-old girl in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This young girl was reported missing in July of 2000 and was found a few weeks later lifeless in the basement of an abandoned apartment building in August of 2000. Unfortunately, for this crime, there is little to no evidence and the case went cold for multiple years. The only piece of of evidence they had was a strange t-shirt. It wasn't until 7 years later in 2007 when DNA analysis advancements were far enough along where they were successfully able to find a matching DNA sample to someone that they arrested years prior for shoplifting and forgery. They finally had a lead and a perfect DNA match, closely linking this criminal to at least the owner of this t-shirt, which was directly at the crime scene. Although when they found out who this t-shirt belonged to, they had a whole new problem that they had to solve. They knew they had their guy, Alexis Flores, but when searching the database, they also saw that Alexis Flores was no longer in the United States. Alexis was actually deported years prior for other unrelated charges, and unfortunately, the authorities had no idea where he was. It's pretty shocking how somebody can do something once again so brazen in broad daylight and have absolutely nobody report or see anything, at least anything that was able to bring him to justice. Bhadresh Kumar Chetanbhai Patel. Ladies and gentlemen, before we get into the disgusting actions of the last person on the FBI's most wanted list, I just wanted to mention two quick things. When doing research for this video, I not only researched those who are currently on this list, but I also made a list of some of the most infamous people that have ever been on this list that has existed for over 70 years. And although YouTube doesn't necessarily love videos on these topics, if you guys want that video, I'd be more than happy to make a video about the most infamous people to ever be on the list. So leave a like or leave a comment letting me know you'd be interested in that video. And while the FBI most wanted list is definitely the most famous list, there is also another list full of dangerous criminals. That list is the US Marshals most wanted list, and they currently have 15 extremely dangerous criminals listed on there. So if either of those videos are something that you'd want to see, I'd be more than happy to cover. Just let me know by leaving a like or a comment. Now let's proceed with our final entry. Bhadresh Kumar shares a very similar and disturbing similarity to the first entry on this list. Bhadresh Kumar and Alejandro both worked at restaurants with their significant others. Bhadresh Kumar worked at a Dunkin' Donuts with his wife, and it's at that same Dunkin' Donuts where Bhadresh Kumar's wife would pass away. Customers entered this Dunkin' Donuts and called police after realizing that there was no employees at the store whatsoever. And once police entered the store, they checked in the back and found a lifeless employee, this employee being the wife of Bhadresh Kumar. Security footage pointed obviously to Bhadresh Kumar murdering his wife, as there was footage of both of them stepping in the back room and only Bhadresh Kumar leaving the back room before he fled the scene. Bhadresh Kumar was last seen taking a taxi from a hotel in New Jersey to a train station in Newark, where he hasn't been seen or heard from since. Hence why the FBI was so eager to put him on this list, as without any information or tips, this man is walking the streets free, and nobody wants that. After doing research for this video, I have two pretty crazy takeaways, and I want to know yours as well. To me, it seems so crazy that some people can just get away with such brazen and crazy crimes. And it also seems extremely saddening how simply going to Mexico can be a get-out-of-jail-free card. If you happen to know anything about some of these people, drop a tip at the FBI, and you might just be a little bit richer.